The basalt runs black along the north rim of Camas Prairie, fractured slabs and broken columns rising out of the snow like the bones of something the earth tried to bury and could not. In January, the wind comes over the ridge in a straight, unbroken line, and the snow does not fall so much as move, sideways, always sideways, scraping across dark rock until the air itself turns white and the ground disappears. A man climbs through it, one hand on the stone, the other gripping an axe. He's not dressed for this. His mittens are split leather, stiff with ice. He moves by feel, not sight, because there's nothing to see. Behind him, in the draw below, an empty wood sled sits half buried in a drift. The rope that should connect it to his shoulder trails loose in the snow, already disappearing. Marion Price had not come to Idaho Territory to die in a hole. He had come because coal dust had started eating his lungs at 29, and a doctor in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, told him that mountain air might buy him another decade if he stopped breathing anthracite. That was 7 years ago. Now he stood on a claim 12 miles north of Soldier, Alturas County, in the first week of January 1888, and the mountain air was trying to kill him faster than the coal ever had. The claim sat where the sage flats buckled upward into broken basalt, a belt of dark fractured rock that ran along the north rim of Camas Prairie like the spine of something buried. Below the ridge, a draw held scrub cedar and serviceberry, most of it thin, most of it claimed or cut by men who had arrived a full season before Marion. Above the ridge, wind stripped the snow to blue ice, and nothing grew at all. He had brought Mara and the children west on the promise of 6 cords of firewood, paid in advance to Harlan Bow, the soldier storekeeper who also ran freight between Haley and the prairie settlements. 6 cords, 4 by 4 by 8 feet each, 128 cubic feet of stacked fuel per cord, enough to hold a drafty cabin through a hard winter if a man fed the stove through every watch of the night. Bow had taken the money in September. The wood had not come. Mara Price knew before Marion did. She kept the accounts in a cloth-bound ledger she had carried from Pennsylvania, and she could read a dwindling pile the way a banker reads a falling balance. By late December, she had stopped asking when the delivery would arrive. She had started counting what they had. 3 armloads of willow, dry but thin, the kind that burned bright and fast and left nothing. 1 broken chair that Marion had promised to mend. 4 fence rails he refused to touch because without the fence the mule would wander, and without the mule they could not haul anything at all. And that was the sum of it. Less than 1/8 of a cord. Enough heat for perhaps 2 days if they burned everything, including the chair, including the rails, including the crate that held Tamsin's 3 books, and the corn husk doll Mara's mother had sent from Portland. Their cabin was 16 by 20 feet, built from lumber Marion had freighted himself in 2 trips from a mill near Haley. The roof was plank, not sod, which meant it shed rain but held no warmth. The north wall had gaps where the chinking had cracked and fallen during the first hard freeze in November. Marion had stuffed rags into the worst of them, but on a still night Mara could hold a candle near the north wall and watch the flame lean. On a windy night she did not bother. She could feel the cold pushing through without a candle to prove it. The stove was sheet iron, bought secondhand in Haley, from a man who was leaving for Oregon and wanted $12 for a $40 piece of metal. It worked. It ate wood the way Ivor ate porridge, steadily, without stopping, and with no visible satisfaction. On a calm night at 20 degrees, the stove needed feeding every 2 hours. On a windy night at 0, Marion fed it every 45 minutes and still woke to frost on the inside of the window glass. Ivor was 4. He had started coughing in December, a wet sound that lived in his chest and woke him at night. Mara kept him wrapped in every blanket they owned, except the one Tamsin used, and still his hands turned blue at the fingertips before dawn. Tamsin was 7 and old enough to understand that the wood should have come and had not, old enough to watch her father's face when he stood at the empty rack and said nothing, and old enough to stop asking why the cabin was cold. Marion had gone to Soldier twice to find Bow. The first time, Bow said the team had broken down on the Haley Road and the wood would come before Christmas. The second time, 3 days after Christmas, Beau leaned across the counter of his store and said the wood could not be delivered at any price now, the roads being what they were, but he would be glad to hold the account against Marion's improvements on the claim. Marion understood the offer. Beau wanted the claim. The spring near the basalt ridge made the ground valuable, not for farming, which was marginal at best in this wind-scoured country, but for water rights that a smarter man could sell to the next wave of settlers pushing north from the Snake River. If Marion abandoned the claim before proving improvements, the land office would release it. Beau had cash and connections. Marion had a coughing son and less than 2 days of fuel. He could not leave. If he walked away from the claim, Beau took the land and the $47 Marion had paid for wood that never arrived. Mara had no family closer than Portland, Oregon, and no money for passage. They had one mule, no wagon team, and a 4-year-old boy whose cough worsened every night. The nearest standing timber worth cutting was up the basalt ridge, a 1.5 miles of steep ground where wind packed the snow into ice hard enough to turn an axe edge. And even if Marion could reach it, even if he could fell green cedar in a gale, he could not drag enough down the ridge to feed that stove for a week, let alone a winter. The math did not work. Mara had done it in her ledger, and Marion had done it in his head, and the numbers arrived at the same place. They could not buy wood, they could not borrow it, they could not cut enough to matter, and they could not leave. That was the shape of things on the 5th of January, 1888, when Ephraim Vale rode his mule up the frozen track to the Price cabin and stood in the doorway without removing his hat. Ephraim Vale was 64 years old, and had spent 30 of those years moving men and freight between Boise and the Wood River mines. He had wintered teamsters in canvas-roof depots, buried 2 drivers who froze between stations, and once kept 14 horses alive through a 3-week blow by burning sagebrush in iron barrels and standing watch in 4-hour shifts. He did not offer opinions lightly, and when he did, he expected them to be received as facts. He stood in the Price cabin and did not sit down. He looked at the stove, which was ticking as the last piece of willow collapsed into ash. He looked at the north wall, where a rag fluttered in a crack. He looked at the stovepipe, which rose only 4 feet above the roofline, too short to draw properly in a crosswind. He looked at the empty wood rack beside the door, a structure built to hold 2 cords that held nothing at all. Mara sat on the bed with Ivor against her chest, and Tamsin pressed to her side. She had folded the last clean blanket over both children. She did not speak. She watched Ephraim the way a person watches a doctor who has not yet said the word. Ephraim walked outside. Marion followed. The old man circled the cabin once, slowly, his boots crunching on frozen mud. He checked the chinking from the outside, pressing his thumb against the gaps. He looked at the roof line, the door frame, the absence of a hay bale windbreak on the north side. He walked to the wood rack and laid one gloved hand on the empty rail. "How much do you have?" Ephraim said. It was not a question. 3 armloads of willow, Marion said. Some fence rails. The fence holds your mule. I know. Your stovepipe is too short. Wind pushes the draw backward. You're losing heat up the chimney and through the north wall at the same time. A tight cabin could maybe limp on 1/3 of a cord per week if a man watched it day and night. This cabin will eat twice that in a hard blow. Ephraim removed his hand from the rack. You have enough wood for a day and a half, maybe 2 if you sit in the dark and feed it splinters. Marion said nothing. A man with no cordwood in January has already chosen his grave, Ephraim said. He did not say it with cruelty. He said it the way a man states the distance to a town that cannot be reached before dark. I paid for 6 cords, Marion said. Beau took the money. Beau takes everybody's money. That does not put wood in your rack. Ephraim looked at the cabin, then at the ridge above it, then at the sky, which was the color of old pewter and moving fast from the northwest. You have children in there. I know what I have. Then you know what you have to do. Get them to soldier. Find a family with room. Work for your keep until spring and start over. If I leave the claim, Beau takes it. Ephraim studied Marion for a long moment. His face was leather dark and deeply lined, and his eyes had the flat quality of a man who had seen enough frozen bodies to stop being surprised by them. Then Bo takes it, Ephraim said. A claim is dirt. Your boy is not dirt. He mounted his mule, turned it toward the track, and rode south without looking back. The wind caught the snow from his mule's hooves and scattered it across the yard like ashes. Marion stood beside the empty rack. Inside the cabin, Ivor coughed. He did not sleep that night. He fed the stove the broken chair at midnight, one leg at a time, and the fence rails at 3 a.m, and he sat with his back against the east wall and watched the iron box consume everything he had left. Mara lay with both children under every covering they owned, her eyes open in the dark, watching him watching the fire. Neither of them said the word. The word was leave. It hung in the cabin like smoke, and neither of them breathed it. At 4 a.m, with the last rail burning and the temperature outside somewhere below zero, Marion did not check. He did not want the number. He pulled on his coat, his split leather mittens, and his wool cap. He took the axe, the bow saw, and the rope, and he dragged the empty wood sled out of the lean-to where the mule stood shivering under a horse blanket. "Where?" Mara said from the doorway. One word. "The ridge. There is dead cedar in the draw, maybe serviceberry." "You cannot cut enough." "I can cut some." She stood in the doorway with the cold pouring past her into the cabin and the heat bleeding out into the dark, and she did not argue, because arguing required an alternative, and there was no alternative. Marion hooked the sled rope over his shoulder and walked north into the wind. The draw was a shallow fold in the land between the sage flat and the basalt ridge, a place where runoff collected in spring and scrub timber grew in a thin, crooked line. In September, it had looked like timber. In January, under 2 feet of wind-packed snow, it looked like a graveyard of sticks. Marion could see the dark lines of dead cedar branches against the white ground, but the trunks were thin, 4 inches, 5 inches. And the wood was dry, which meant it would burn fast and leave little heat. He cut what he could. The axe bit into frozen wood with a sound like a gunshot, and the pieces fell into snow so deep that he had to dig them out by hand. His mittens soaked through. His fingers stiffened. He loaded the sled with what amounted to half an armload, barely enough to feed the stove for a few hours, and looked up the draw toward the ridge. The snow was heavier above. The wind had been building since before dawn, coming from the northwest in gusts that threw ice crystals into his eyes and erased the draw ahead of him. He could not see the notch he had planned to follow up to the ridge where the larger cedars stood. The land was white and featureless and moving. He should have turned back. He knew that. Every reasonable voice in his head, Ephraim's voice, Mara's voice, his own voice on a calmer day, told him to drag the half-loaded sled home and burn what he had, and face the morning with whatever it brought. But the morning would bring the same empty rack and the same ticking stove and the same blue fingers on his son's hands. And Marion was not ready to face that arithmetic again. He left the sled. He took the axe and the rope and climbed. The basalt started 50 yards above the draw, dark rock breaking through the snow in jagged slabs and loose plates. The wind hit harder here, coming over the ridge in a straight, unbroken line with nothing to slow it. Snow moved sideways across the rock face in sheets, and Marion could not see more than 30 feet ahead. He kept his left hand on the rock and his right hand on the axe and moved by feel, looking for the line of cedars he had seen from below in autumn. He did not find the cedars. He found something else. He had crawled between 2 basalt blocks to escape a gust that nearly took him off his feet. The blocks leaned against each other like tired men, forming a narrow wedge of shelter where the wind noise dropped from a scream to a moan. He pressed his back against the rock and breathed and waited. That was when he saw the vapor, a thin white thread rising from a black split in the basalt 6 feet ahead of him. At first he thought it was his own breath, blown forward and caught in an eddy. He held his breath. The vapor continued. It rose from the fissure in a steady, slow curl, like steam from a kettle on the lowest flame. He crawled forward. The split was narrow, 2 feet wide at the surface, tapering into darkness below. The rock on either side was dark, wet, and the snow around the opening was different from the snow everywhere else. It was thin, glazed, melted, and refrozen into a skin of ice that had a slick, wet sheen. Marion pulled off his right mitten and held his bare hand over the fissure. Warm air. Not a guess. Not a wish. Not a desperate man imagining comfort. Warm air rising from the rock, damp and mineral smelling, and warm enough that the snow could not hold its shape within 2 feet of the opening. His father's voice came back to him across 15 years and 2,000 miles. A coal mine near Pottsville. The two of them standing in a low gallery while water dripped from the ceiling and the mule waited behind them in the dark. His father had pressed Marion's palm against the tunnel wall, and the stone had been warm, and his father had said, "Warm rock is not comfort until you know where the air goes." Where the air goes. His father had lowered a candle to test the draft. If the flame leaned toward you, the air was coming from somewhere deeper, and you could trust it. If the flame leaned away, the air was leaving, and where it went might not be a place for men. Marion did not have a candle. He had an axe, a rope, split mittens, and a body that was losing heat faster than it could make it. He stared at the vapor rising from the black crack in the basalt, and he thought about Ivor's cough, and Mara's hands folding the last blanket, and Ephraim's flat voice saying, "A man with no cordwood in January has already chosen his grave." He tied the rope to a rock spur above the fissure. He tested the knot twice. Then he lowered himself into the crack, sideways, scraping his ribs against wet stone, and the wind above him faded like a door closing. 20 feet in, the noise stopped. The howling that had filled his head for hours dropped to a low, distant hum, like hearing a storm through a wall. The fissure was narrow. His shoulders touched both sides, and dark, and the air was warmer with every step. 40 feet in, his mittens softened. The leather, which had been stiff as board, relaxed against his fingers. He pulled off his cap. Sweat ran down the back of his neck, which was a sensation so foreign after weeks of cold that it startled him. The passage opened, first shoulder high, where he could stand without ducking. Then room high, where the blackness above him swallowed the sound of his breathing. Then wider still, into a pocket of space where the rock walls drew apart and the air itself changed, heavier, wetter, warmer, with a mineral smell that reminded him of the water that seeped through mine walls, rich with dissolved stone. He could not see the chamber. He stood in absolute darkness with warm air on his face and water dripping somewhere ahead, each drop landing with a soft, ringing note on stone. The drops were warm. He held out his hand and let one strike his palm, and it was warm. He was not a geologist. He did not know the word geothermal. He did not know that beneath him, deep in the basalt of the Snake River Plain, the remnant heat of a volcanic province that had been active for millions of years still pushed warm water and steam through cracks and fissures toward the surface. He did not know any of that. What he knew was that the rock was warm, the air was warm, and the water was warm, and outside his children were freezing. He climbed back out. The cold hit him like a plunge into a river. He stood above the fissure with the wind tearing at his coat and the vapor rising between his boots, and for the first time in weeks he did not feel the specific terror that had lived in his chest since the wood failed to come. He felt something else. He felt the beginning of a calculation. The cabin was losing heat faster than he could feed it. That was the math that could not be solved, but the ridge was already warm. The earth beneath the basalt was producing heat without being fed, without being tended, without anyone cutting or hauling or paying Harlan Bow for the privilege of staying alive. The question was whether he could get his family inside the rock before the cold killed them in the cabin. He did not go straight home. He went back into the fissure. This time he brought the rope farther, tying it to a second spur where the passage widened, and he moved deeper, one hand on the wall and one hand in front of his face. He counted paces. The narrow throat ran about 20 feet. The first open space was perhaps 14 feet across. He could not see the far wall, but he paced it, arms out, and touched rock at roughly 14 steps. The ceiling was above his reach. He jumped once, and his fingers brushed stone at what he guessed was 7 feet. The floor was uneven but not sharply broken, smooth in places where water had run, rough where mineral deposits had built up in crusts. Along the back wall, the warmth intensified. He pressed his palm flat against the stone and held it there. Hot. Not scalding, but too hot for comfort, the kind of heat that would redden skin if held long enough. Steam seeped from a crack low in the back wall, a thin, steady exhalation that kept the chamber damp and warm. The air smelled of minerals, but not of rot. It smelled clean in the way that deep stone smells clean. No organic decay, no stagnant water, just rock and heat and moisture. He marked the wall with charcoal from his pocket. A vertical line at the entrance, a cross where the chamber opened, an arrow pointing toward the warm seam. Then he climbed out again, retrieved the sled from the draw, and dragged his half-load of scrub cedar home in the dark. Mara was standing at the door. The stove had gone out. "I found something," Marion said. She looked at the sled, half an armload. Not enough to restart the stove for more than an hour. "Not wood," he said. "Something else." He told her. He told her about the vapor, the fissure, the warm air, the chamber, the hot stone, the dripping water. He told her about his father in the mine. He told her that the rock was warm enough to sleep beside, that the air was moving, that the wind could not reach it. Mara listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "How do you know the air is safe?" "My father tested with a candle. I did not have one." "Then you went into a crack in the ground in the dark without knowing whether the air would kill you." "Yes." She stood in the doorway of a cabin that was now as cold inside as it was outside, with 2 children wrapped in blankets behind her and a stove full of ash. She looked at Marion's face, which was flushed and sweating despite the freezing wind, and she could see that whatever he had found had changed the shape of his fear. He was still afraid, but it was a different fear now, not the paralysis of the trapped, but the urgency of a man who has seen a door and does not know if it leads somewhere safe. "We need a candle," she said. Marion burned the scrub cedar to heat water for the children and made coffee from the last grounds. He found a candle stub in Mara's sewing box, 2 inches of tallow, enough for perhaps 20 minutes of light. Before dawn, he went back to the ridge. This time he entered the fissure with the candle lit, cupping the flame with his hand through the narrow throat. At the entrance, the flame burned straight. 10 feet in, it leaned gently toward him. The warm air was pushing outward, which meant the draft moved from inside to outside. His father's rule held: air coming toward you could be trusted. Air leaving was suspect. At the chamber opening, the flame steadied. It did not gutter. It did not burn blue. It burned yellow and even, which meant the air was not depleted of what a flame needed to survive, and if a flame could breathe here, a person likely could too. He held the candle at floor level, steady, at chest height, steady, near the warm seam in the back wall. The flame leaned slightly away from the stone, pushed by the steam, but it did not die. He marked the floor with charcoal. Candle good, at 3 heights. Then he explored the dimensions properly. The chamber was roughly 14 by 22 feet, longer than it was wide, with a ceiling that varied between 6.5 and 7.5 feet. The warm seam ran along the lower back wall for about 8 feet. The floor sloped gently toward the entrance, which meant water would drain outward. Good. A raised section along the left wall, a natural stone shelf about 10 inches above the main floor, was dry and warm, but not hot. A sleeping platform. The entrance throat was the problem. 27 inches wide at the tightest point, 6 feet long, barely passable for a grown man sideways. A child could walk through. Mara could squeeze through. But moving supplies, bedding, or anything wider than a flour sack would require planning. He crawled back out into the wind and sat on the basalt with the empty candle holder and thought about what he was considering. Moving his family out of a cabin, a structure with walls and a door and a stove, built by human hands for human habitation, into a crack in the ground. a wet, dark, mineral-smelling crack in the ground where no one had ever lived, where the air might change, where the roof might fall, where scalding water seeped from stone, where his children would live in lamplight and his wife would sleep on rock. It sounded insane. He knew exactly how it sounded. He could hear Ephraim's voice, flat and final, telling him what any sensible person would say. But the cabin was 22 degrees inside when he left. The stove was cold. His son's fingers were blue, and the chamber in the rock was warmer than any room Marion had entered since October. The cabin was losing heat faster than he could replace it. That was the fact that would not change. No amount of scrub cedar, no amount of willpower, no miraculous delivery of cordwood from Harlan Bow would change the fundamental arithmetic of a poorly chinked cabin with a short stovepipe and a sheet iron stove in an Idaho winter. But the earth beneath the ridge had been holding its heat for longer than any person had been alive to measure it. The earth did not need fuel. The earth did not need tending. The earth was warm. He went home and told Mara he wanted to move the family into the cave. She did not say yes. She said, "First you answer every question I can think of, and then I will decide." Before Mara could ask her questions, Peter Aasen arrived. Peter was a Norwegian farmer, 42, broad and careful, with a quarter section 2 miles east. He had a proper cabin with better chinking and a proper stove with a longer pipe and 2 cords of fir stacked against the north wall under a canvas tarp. He was not desperate. He was, in his quiet way, a man who kept track of his neighbors because keeping track of neighbors was what you did when the nearest town was 12 miles away and the doctor was farther. He found Marion in the lean-to, loading the sled with blankets. "Where are you going with bedding?" Peter said. Marion told him about the cave, the fissure, the warm air, the chamber, the candle test, the dimensions. He told it plainly, without excitement, the way a man lays out a plan he knows will be questioned. Peter listened with his arms folded. When Marion finished, Peter said, "Warm air in a crack is not a house." "I know that." "Where does the smoke go? If you light a fire inside, where does the smoke go?" "I would not light a fire inside. The stone is the fire." "Where do the children sleep?" "There is a raised shelf along the left wall, 10 inches above the floor. Dry." "Where does waste go? You have a 4-year-old. You have a 7-year-old. Where do they go when they need to go?" "Outside or in the entrance throat where the cold air keeps it from fouling the chamber." "What happens if the entrance freezes shut?" Marion paused. He had not considered that. Steam from the warm air meeting cold air at the entrance could ice over the opening. "I would keep it cleared," he said, "or leave a slit open." "And if you cannot clear it? If you are asleep? If the snow drifts? If the ice builds in the night?" "Then we chop our way out." Peter unfolded his arms. He looked at the cabin behind them, where no smoke rose from the pipe. He looked at the ridge above them, where the wind drove snow sideways across the basalt. He looked at Marion, who was sweating inside his coat despite the cold, because he had been in and out of the fissure 3 times, and his body had not yet decided what temperature it was. "You are going to take 2 children into a hole in the ground," Peter said, "because you believe the ground is warmer than the sky." "The ground is warmer. I have felt it. The candle burned clean at 3 heights. And if the candle was wrong, if the air changes, if the steam carries something you cannot smell, then we are no worse than we are now. The cabin is dead, Peter. The stove is cold. I have nothing left to burn. We stay in the cabin. We freeze. That is not a guess. That is arithmetic." Peter looked at the empty wood rack. He looked at the silent stovepipe. He looked at the cabin that was, as Marion said, dead. "I am not telling you that you are right," Peter said. "I'm telling you that everything you do not know about that hole could kill your children faster than the cold." "I know." "And you're still going." "I am still going." Peter turned toward his own track, then stopped. "If you die in there," he said, "nobody will know to come looking. The snow will cover the entrance by morning." "Then come looking," Marion said. Peter walked away. He did not say he would come, and he did not say he would not. Mara asked her questions that afternoon in the cabin, while both children slept under a pile of blankets and the last daylight came through the frost-covered window. She asked where the lamp would sit. Marion told her about the shelf he had seen along the right wall, shoulder height, flat enough for a tin lamp. She asked how they would keep Tamsin from wandering deeper into the fissure. Marion said he would run a rope from wall to wall at the chamber's far edge and tell her the rope was the end of the world. She asked what would happen if Ivor's cough worsened in damp air. Marion admitted he did not know, but the air in the chamber was warm and warm, wet air was easier on lungs than cold, dry air. He told her what the coal miners knew. Dry cold cracked the chest, damp warmth opened it. She asked about the entrance. 27 inches at the squeeze. Ivor would fit. Tamsin would fit. Mara would fit. Everything they owned that was wider than 27 inches would not. "We leave the stove," Marion said. "We leave the stove. We take blankets, food, the lamp, oil, the Bible, the iron pot, children's boots, matches, spare clothes, the flour sack, anything that fits through the throat." Mara looked at the cabin. 16 by 20 feet of nailed lumber and chinked logs that represented everything they had built since arriving in Idaho territory. Leaving it meant leaving the structure that defined them as settlers, as homesteaders, as people who had come to this place with the intention of staying. "If we go," she said, "and it works, we can come back in spring." "Yes." "And if we go and it does not work?" "Then we come back sooner. The cabin will still be here. It will just be cold." Mara pressed her palms together between her knees. She looked at Ivor, who was asleep with his mouth open and his breath making a small, wet, rattling sound that neither of them could pretend was healthy. "Then we go before dark," she said. "Not after." They left the cabin at 3:30 in the afternoon, with perhaps 90 minutes of gray winter light remaining. Marion carried the flour sack on his back and the iron pot in his right hand. Mara carried Ivor on her hip and held Tamsin's hand. Between them, loaded on the wood sled, they had 4 blankets, the quilted coverlet from their bed, Mara's Bible, a sack of beans, half a sack of cornmeal, a tin of coffee, a tin of lard, a box of matches in an oilskin pouch, lamp oil in a clay jug, Tamsin's 3 books, Ivor's wool hat, 2 pairs of spare socks, and the stove poker. The stove poker was Mara's addition. She did not explain why, and Marion did not ask. They walked north across the sage flat and up the draw toward the basalt ridge. The wind was steady and cold coming from the northwest with the particular insistence of weather that has not yet decided whether to become a storm. The snow was knee-deep off the packed track, and Tamsin struggled, and Mara shifted Ivor to her other hip twice, and Marion pulled the sled with the rope biting into his shoulder and his boots slipping on ice underneath the powder. Nobody saw them leave, or so Marion thought. In fact, Peter Assen's wife Liv saw them from the rise east of her cabin, a line of dark figures moving uphill against the white, pulling a loaded sled toward the broken rock of the ridge. Liv told Peter at supper. Peter said nothing, finished his meal, and went outside to check the wood stack. At the ridge, Marion cleared the fissure entrance of fresh snow and helped Tamsin through first, holding her hands as she stepped into the dark. Then the supplies, piece by piece, passed from Marion to Mara to Tamsin, who stacked them just inside the throat where the passage widened. Then Ivor, handed through, wrapped in a blanket, too sick to be frightened. Then Mara, sideways, her back against one wall and her belly against the other, breathing in short, measured breaths. Marion came last. He pulled a bundle of pine boughs over the entrance. He had cut them that morning and stacked them near the opening, and dragged them into the throat behind him, sealing the fissure mouth against the wind. Not airtight. He left a gap at the top, a slit about the width of his fist, because his father had said, "You seal a space against weather, but never against air." Inside, the darkness was complete. Mara lit the lamp with steady hands, and the chamber appeared around them in amber light. Stone walls beaded with moisture, a rough ceiling lost in shadow, the warm seam breathing steam along the back wall, and the natural shelf where Marion had said they would sleep. Tamsin stood in the middle of the chamber and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. Then she looked at Marion and said, "It is warm." It was, after weeks of cold that lived in their bones, cold that cracked skin and stiffened joints and turned every breath into a visible cloud. The cave chamber held at something near 60 degrees, warm enough that within 10 minutes Mara unwrapped Ivor from his blankets, and he lay on the stone shelf in his shirt, with his eyes open and his hands, for the first time in weeks, the color of living skin. Marion sat on the floor with his back against the wall. His hands were split from hauling stone and cutting boughs, and his ribs ached where the fissure had scraped them, and his legs trembled from the climb with a loaded sled. But the rock behind his back was warm, and the air around his family was warm, and the wind that had ruled their lives for 2 months was a distant, defeated sound somewhere above, unable to reach them. The first night in the cave, Ivor did not cough until dawn. When he did, the sound echoed off the stone walls and came back softened, as if the rock itself absorbed the sharp edges. Mara held him and looked at Marion across the lamp flame, and neither of them said the word that hung between them. The word was, The word reached Soldier the next day, carried by a freighter who had passed the Price cabin and seen it dark, doorless, and empty. Harlan Bow heard it first. He stood behind his counter in the store that doubled as post office, freight depot, and credit ledger for half the claims on the North Prairie, and he listened to the freighter describe the abandoned cabin, and he smiled the particular smile of a man whose patience with a debtor has been rewarded. "Gone, then," Bow said. "Gone from the cabin," the freighter said. "Not gone from the claim. His mule is still in the lean-to." "A mule does not prove a claim. Improvements prove a claim, and a man who walks away from his improvements in January has made his feelings clear." But the freighter had more. He had talked to Pater Ossen's wife, who had talked to Pater, who had mentioned, reluctantly, and only because leave pressed out, that Marion Price had moved his family into a crack in the basalt ridge, into the rock, like animals. Bow's smile changed. It went from the satisfaction of a debt resolved to the narrower pleasure of a competitor making a mistake. "A man who drags children into a rock crack," Bow said to the 3 men warming themselves near his stove, "ought to have them taken from him." The store was quiet. Men looked at the floor, at their boots, at the stove. Nobody argued with Harlan Bow in Harlan Bow's store, not because he was right, but because he held the accounts. "A cave," one of the men said, "in this weather." "Not a cave," Bow said. "A crack. A steaming crack that could be full of gas, or could collapse, or could scald a child to death. And Price, who has no mining experience worth the name, has put his wife and 2 children inside it because he cannot manage a woodpile." The accusation traveled. By evening, the women at the wash bench, the bench near Bow's store, where water could still be drawn from a protected well, had heard that Mara Price had been taken into a hole in the ground by a man who had lost his wits. The word badger appeared. "Price is turning badger." The women said it with a mixture of pity and something harder, because the frontier did not forgive men who endangered children, and a mother who followed such a man into a steaming crack was either a saint or a fool, and the difference depended on whether the children survived. None of this reached Marion inside the cave. He did not know, on that second morning, that the town had decided he was mad. He knew only that the chamber was 63 degrees near the sleeping platform, 42 degrees in the entrance throat, and below 0 outside. He knew that Ivor had slept 5 hours without coughing. He knew that Mara had organized the food stores along the cooler entrance zone and had found a flat stone near the lamp shelf where she could set the iron pot. He knew that Tamsin had discovered the red yarn rope Marion had strung across the back of the chamber and had asked why she could not cross it, and Marion had told her the truth. The rock beyond the rope was too hot to touch, and the steam could burn. He also knew that the bow door he had built was already wrong. By mid-morning, the lamp was smoking, and Mara's head ached, and the air tasted thick. The pine boughs, stuffed tight to block the wind, had sealed the entrance too well. The warm air inside had nowhere to go. The chamber was ventilating through the fissure above. Warm air rose and escaped through cracks in the ceiling rock, but the fresh air that should have replaced it was blocked by the boughs. Marion pulled out 3 boughs from the top of the seal and cut a slit with his knife, leaving a gap about the width of his fist. Cold air rushed in. The lamp steadied. Mara's headache faded within the hour, but the slit also admitted cold. The entrance throat, which had been in the 40s, dropped toward freezing. The family chamber held, but the corridor between warmth and cold shortened. Marion hung a blanket across the throat, creating a rough division, and the warm chamber held at 61 degrees. It was a problem he would need to solve better, and soon. The entrance was the cave's vulnerability, the one place where the cold could reach them, the one place where the warmth could escape. Every improvement to the seal reduced the cold. Every improvement to the seal reduced the air. The balance between the two was the difference between shelter and a tomb. If anyone has ever doubted you for doing the thing that no one else could see the sense of, tell us about it in the comments. Because what comes next for Marion Price will test whether his instinct was worth the gamble, or whether Harlan Bow was right all along. Marion spent the 3rd day cutting cedar poles from the draw and hauling them up the ridge on the sled. Each trip took 90 minutes, down the slope, cut, drag, haul. He made 4 trips and came back each time with less energy and more wood. By afternoon, he had 6 poles, the longest about 8 feet, the shortest about 4. He used Mara's sewing awl to bore holes near the ends, lashed them together with rope, and built a frame across the entrance throat. A skeleton for a better door. He stuffed the frame with boughs, packed snow against the outside, and draped the horse blanket over the inside. He left the fist-wide draft slit at the top. The entrance zone stabilized at 38 degrees. The family chamber held at 62. On the 4th morning, Tamsin walked to the red yarn rope at the back of the chamber and stood looking past it into the deeper dark. Beyond the rope, the chamber narrowed into a second passage that angled downward and to the left. Warm air came from it, and a sound, not water dripping, but water moving, a low, continuous murmur that suggested a stream somewhere below. "What is down there?" she asked. "I do not know," Marion said. "That is why you do not cross the rope." "Does it go all the way down?" "Down where?" "Down to where the warm comes from." Marion looked at his daughter, who was 7 years old and had not complained once since they entered the cave. Not about the dark, not about the food, not about the stone floor under her blankets, not about the fact that the only sky she had seen in 3 days was the thin sliver of gray visible through the draft slit. "Maybe," he said, "but we do not need to go there. We only need what is here." That afternoon, Ivor slipped. He was walking along the base of the warm wall, which Marion had told him not to do, and his hand touched a patch of mineral crust where the steam had deposited a layer of calcium and silica that looked like rough plaster, but held heat like iron. He screamed. Mara had his hand in cold water from their jug within seconds, but the palm blistered in a line across the base of his fingers, and he cried for an hour. Marion cut a strip from a blanket and wrapped the hand. He moved the red yarn line 2 feet farther from the back wall. He stacked loose stones along the base of the warm section, creating a low barrier that a 4-year-old could not easily cross. That night, with the lamp turned down to save oil, with Ivor whimpering in his sleep and Tamsin reading one of her 3 books by holding it near the warm wall, where the stone's radiant heat made the pages slightly warm to the touch, Marion sat in the entrance throat and listened to the wind. It was louder than it had been. Not just the steady northwest blow that had characterized the past week, but something deeper, a sound with weight behind it. The kind of wind that meant the sky was loading pressure and preparing to deliver. Marion had heard that sound in Pennsylvania before the worst winter storms, and he had heard it twice already in Idaho territory, both times before 3-day blows that buried fences and killed stock. The cave was warm. The cave was sheltering his family. The cave was keeping Ivor's hands the color of living skin and letting Tamsin read by radiant heat. But the cave had a 27-inch throat and a pine bough door and a draft slit that admitted cold air, and a family that depended entirely on the earth continuing to breathe warm. If the earth stopped, if the steam slowed, if the entrance iced, if the ceiling shifted, if the air changed, Marion sat in the entrance throat of a cave that was saving his family, and he was afraid because every solution he had built rested on forces he did not control and did not fully understand, and the wind outside was getting louder, and the weather that was coming would not care whether he had found something warm or not. The question was no longer whether the cave could hold his family for a night, or 2 nights, or a week. The question was whether it could hold them through what was coming, and he did not know what was coming. Not yet. The man who changed everything arrived on the 6th day, and he did not come because he was kind. Jory Penrose was 62 years old, Cornish-born, and had spent more of his life underground than above it. He had worked the Comstock lode in Nevada when the deep shafts hit water at 160 degrees and men died of heat as often as cave-ins. He had timbered square sets for Sutro, shoveled ore at Crown Point, and broken rock in a dozen properties whose names he no longer remembered because the names did not matter. Only the rock mattered, and what the rock would do if you did not listen to it. He had come to Idaho Territory the way many Comstock men had, following the silver rumors up to the Wood River District, arriving too late for the best claims, and settling into the work that remained. He repaired road between Haley and Soldier, broke rock when asked, and lived in a room behind a stable that smelled of horse and lamp oil. He had a miner's cough, not the killing kind, not yet, but the kind that sat in his chest like a lodger who paid no rent and refused to leave. His left hand was bent at the 3rd and 4th fingers, where a timber had crushed them 9 years ago, and they had healed in the shape of a fist that could not fully open. He heard Bo mocking Marion Price in the store. He heard the word badger. He heard Bo say that a man with no mining experience had taken children into a steaming crack. And Jory, who had spent 40 years learning what cracks in rock could do to men, walked out of the store, borrowed a mule from the stableman, and rode 12 miles north to the Price claim. He did not ride to rescue anyone. He rode because Bo's description contained 2 details that did not fit. Marion had tied off with rope before entering, and Marion had marked turns with charcoal. A man who ties off and marks turns is not a man who has lost his wits. A man who ties off and marks turns is a man who learned something underground somewhere and is applying it. Jory found the cabin dark and the mule in the lean-to with a half-frozen bucket of water. He followed boot tracks up the draw to the basalt ridge and found the fissure by its vapor. "Hello, the hole," he called. Silence. Then Marion's voice muffled by stone. "Who is there?" "A man who knows what a tied-off rope means." There was a shuffling sound inside the fissure, the scrape of the bow door being pulled aside, and Marion appeared in the entrance throat blinking against the daylight. He was in his shirt sleeves. In January. His face was damp with cave condensation, and his eyes had the particular expression of a man who has been living by lamplight and has temporarily forgotten how bright the world is. Jory looked at the entrance. He saw the rope tied to the rock spur, 2 half hitches, snug, the tail tucked. He saw the charcoal marks on the rock inside the throat. He saw the bow and blanket door with the draft slit at the top. He said nothing for a full minute, which was his way of thinking. "You were a coal man," Jory said. "My father was. I handled mules." "You were underground." "From 8 years old." "You tested the air." "Candle, floor, chest, and near the seam. It burned clean." Jory's bent hand rested on the basalt beside the entrance. He pressed his palm flat, the way Marion had done, and held it. He felt the warmth. He looked at the vapor, the wet lip of the fissure, the melted snow. "Show me," he said. Jory moved through the cave the way water moves through a channel, finding the edges, filling every low point, flowing without hurrying. He touched the walls before he looked at them. He listened. He stood still in the middle of the family chamber, with his head tilted, eyes closed, for 30 seconds. And when he opened them, he said, "The draft is moving. Good." He looked at the bow door. He looked at the draft slit. He looked at the blanket hung across the entrance throat. He looked at the sleeping platform where Mara and the children had arranged their blankets, and at the food stores in the cooler zone, and at the red yarn line Marion had strung near the back wall. He looked at the mineral crust that had burned Ivor's hand. Then he looked at Marion. "You learned just enough in coal country not to die quick," Jory said. "Now learn enough not to die slow." Mara, who had been watching from the sleeping platform with Ivor on her lap, said, "What does he need to learn?" Jory turned to her. Most men of his generation did not answer women's questions about underground work. Jory had buried 2 partners and a nephew in Comstock shafts, and all of them had died because someone in the decision chain had not listened to the person closest to the problem. 3 things, Jory said. Air, stone, water, in that order. He has the air nearly right. The stone and the water will kill him if he does not fix them. Jory's first teaching was air, and he taught it the way he had learned it, by nearly dying. He took the candle stub Marion had been using and showed him what a proper test looked like. Floor level first, not just held at knee height, but set on the stone and watched from above. The flame should be yellow and steady. If it burned blue at the base, the air at floor level carried something that displaced what flame needed. Then chest height, held still, no hand shielding it. The flame should not gutter or lean unless a draft explained the lean. Then near the warm seam, close enough to feel the steam, far enough that the steam itself did not push the flame. You tested at 3 heights, Jory said. Good, but you tested once. Air changes. The seam breathes. When the weather shifts, the pressure outside changes, and the cave breathes differently. You test every morning, every evening, every time the wind changes direction. He had Marion crawl ahead through the passage toward the second chamber, while Mara watched the candle from behind. This was the test Marion had not done. What happened to the air when a body blocked the passage? A man moving through a narrow space displaces air. If the passage has only one direction of flow, the person ahead gets the old air and the person behind gets the new air. The candle behind Marion guttered once. Mara called out. Jory stopped them both. One person moves at a time, Jory said. The other watches the flame. If the flame dies, nobody moves forward. You come back. He showed Marion where condensation formed on the ceiling, droplets that meant warm, wet air was hitting cooler stone above. Where condensation was heavy, the air was moving slowly. Where the ceiling was dry, the air was moving fast. The heavy condensation zones were where bad air could pool if the draft weakened. The warm seam pushes air up, Jory said. The cold entrance pulls air in. As long as those 2 forces work, the chamber breathes. But if you seal the entrance too tight, the warm air has nowhere to go. It builds up. The flame dies. Then you die. I learned that already, Marion said. He told Jory about the headache, the smoking lamp, the boughs sealed too tight. Jory looked at him. You learned it by accident, he said. Accidents teach you once. I am trying to teach you why, so you can predict the next one. The second teaching was stone. Jory ran his bent hand along the entrance throat, pressing at the rock, tapping with his knuckles. He stopped at a point 6 inches from the outside edge, where a crack ran vertically through the basalt, a hairline fracture with frost in it. This lip is fractured, he said. You see the crack, you see the frost. The frost means water got in, froze, and pushed the crack wider. Every freeze cycle makes it worse. One good blow, one shift in the rock, and this lip comes down, the entrance closes. Marion stared at the crack. He had passed through the entrance a dozen times and not seen it. Jory pulled 2 short poles from the sled Marion had left near the fissure. He wedged them sideways into the throat, one at waist height and one at shoulder height, bracing the fractured lip against the opposite wall. He shimmed them with flat stones, tapping each one in with the heel of his palm until the poles were tight. This is not mining timber, he said. This is a crib. It does not hold the mountain. It gives you warning. If the lip shifts, the poles crack first. You hear the crack. You have time to move. He built a second crib at the inner end of the throat, where the passage opened into the family chamber. He used sled runners. Marion's sled was now disassembled, its runners becoming the bones of the shelter, and green poles cut from the draw, lashed and shimmed. "Do not swing an axe against this rock," Jory said. "Do not hammer. Do not strike. The basalt is columnar here. The joints between the columns are weak. Vibration travels along the joints and loosens plates above you. If you need to break stone, use a pick point and tap. Never swing." He took Marion's axe out of the chamber and left it outside. The third teaching was water. The warm seep along the back wall was not a single flow. It was a series of small trickles that emerged from the crack where steam rose, ran along the lower wall, and collected in a shallow depression near the center of the chamber. In the first days, Marion had simply avoided the wet area. Jory showed him why that would not work. "Water remembers the lowest place," Jory said. He scratched the stone floor with a pick point, drawing a line from the seep along the base of the warm wall toward the entrance throat. "The seep will follow the low ground. Right now it pools in the center. When the rain comes, when the thaw comes, the water will find every crack, and the lowest place in this chamber is where your children sleep." He was right. The sleeping platform was 10 inches above the floor, but the floor sloped gently away from the platform and then back toward it along the far wall. In a heavy seep, water would circle the room and pool at the platform's base. Jory took the pick point and scratched a shallow groove along the base of the warm wall, angling it slightly toward the entrance throat. The groove was no deeper than a finger joint, but it gave the water a path, a channel that led from the seep toward the cooler entrance zone where the water would eventually drain or freeze. "Drainage first," Jory said. "Before you build anything else, you build the place where water goes. In a mine, the water kills more men than the rock." He raised the sleeping platform another 2 inches by sliding flat stones under the sled runners that supported it. He laid a strip of oiled canvas, his own, from his road repair kit across the top. He checked the slope. He poured water from the jug at the platform's high end and watched it run off to the right, toward the groove. "Cold settles low," Jory said. "Water remembers the lowest place. Put people above both." Marion worked under Jory's direction for 3 days. Each day the cave became less like a crack in the ground and more like a place where people could survive. Day 7. The poles were shimmed, the drainage groove was cut, and the sleeping platform was solid enough that Tamsin could jump on it without shifting the runners. Day 8. Marion cut a shelf into the soft mineral deposit on the right wall, 2 feet long and 8 inches deep, and placed the lamp on it. The shelf held. Jory carved a second shelf lower, near the entrance throat, and placed the food stores there: flour sack, beans, cornmeal, lard tin, coffee. The cooler air near the entrance kept the food better than the warmth of the main chamber. Day 9. They explored the second chamber. Jory went first, candle in his bent hand, rope tied to his belt and belayed by Marion from the family chamber. The second passage ran downward at a steep angle for about 30 feet, then opened into a smaller room, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, with a higher ceiling and a hotter floor. Steam was thicker here. The candle burned, but with a shorter, yellower flame that Jory did not trust. "Forbidden," Jory said when he returned. "The air's marginal. The floor is hot enough to blister through boot soles. No child goes there. No adult goes there without a rope and a second person watching the flame from this side." Day 10. Marion built a mule shelter outside the fissure, against a basalt wall that blocked the northwest wind. He piled snow blocks into a 3-sided enclosure, packed sage into the gaps, and laid a canvas scrap over the top. It was not warm, it was less cold. The mule stood in it with its head down and its ears back and did not die, which was the only standard that mattered. Day 11. Jory told Marion to stop. "You are making mistakes," Jory said. "You are placing poles without checking the shims. You are cutting grooves without testing the slope. You are tired, and tired men kill themselves underground." Marion's hands were split across both palms. The cracks in his skin had opened and opened again so many times that the blood had dried in layers, brown and red, and his grip on tools had weakened to the point where the pick point slipped twice in the morning and once struck a spark from the stone. A spark underground can be nothing, or it can be the last thing you see, Jory said. Sit down, eat something, let your hands close. Marion sat. Mar brought him coffee, heated on a flat stone near the warm seam, not boiling, but warm enough to drink. She sat beside him and said nothing, and her silence was the particular silence of a woman who had been watching her husband push past the edge of his competence and was relieved that someone else had told him to stop. On the afternoon of the 11th day, Peter Asen appeared at the fissure entrance. He did not enter. He stood outside with a sack over each shoulder and the wind pulling at his coat, and he called Marion's name. When Marion came to the entrance throat, Peter set down the sacks. 2 sacks of oats, Peter said, and a coil of hay rope. I cannot pay for that. You are not paying. My wife said children should not pay for men's pride. Peter still did not enter the cave. He looked at the entrance with the crib poles visible in the throat, and the bough and blanket door, and the thin stream of vapor escaping through the draft slit. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a river who can see the far bank but does not trust the current. How warm is it? Peter said. 62 in the family chamber, 38 in the throat. Peter's eyebrows moved. 62 degrees. His cabin, with 2 cords of fur and a proper stove, held at about 50 on a good night. The Norwegian in me says the earth should not be warm, Peter said. The farmer in me says use what the earth gives. He left without entering, but he came back 2 days later with 2 poles, longer and straighter than anything Marion had been able to find in the draw. He left them outside the fissure and walked away. Ephraim Vale came on the 13th day. He rode his mule up the draw in late morning and sat on the basalt above the fissure, looking down at the vapor. Marion climbed out to meet him. Jory followed. Ephraim looked at Jory. Penrose, you're still alive. Still, Jory said. You? Still. Ephraim dismounted. He was slower than he had been 8 days earlier, and the cold had stiffened his left knee to the point where he swung his leg over the mule's back in stages, like a man descending stairs. I came to see if the children are alive, Ephraim said. Come see, Marion said. Ephraim entered the cave. He fit through the throat. He was thin the way old men on the frontier were thin, stripped to sinew and habit, and stood in the family chamber with his hat still on and his coat still buttoned, and the warmth hit him. He did not speak for a long time. He looked at the platform. He looked at the drainage groove. He looked at the crib poles in the entrance throat. He looked at the lamp shelf and the food shelf and the red yarn line. He looked at Tamsin, who was reading by the warm wall, and Ivor, who was sleeping on the platform with his burned hand wrapped in cloth and his breathing steady for the first time in weeks. It is warm, Ephraim said. 63 this morning, Marion said. The air's clean? Jory answered. I test twice a day. The draft moves from the seam outward through the entrance. As long as the slit stays open, the cave breathes. Ephraim walked to the warm wall and placed his hand on it, as every person who entered the cave would eventually do. The warmth was undeniable. Not a theory, not a hope, not a desperate man's fantasy. The stone was warm. The air was warm. The children were warm. He walked back to the entrance throat and stopped at the crib poles. He tested one with his hand. It did not move. You have done this properly, Ephraim said. The timber, the drainage, the air testing. I told you a man with no cordwood has chosen his grave. I see you have found a different argument. He did not apologize. He did not take back what he had said. He acknowledged what was in front of him with the precision of a man who valued facts over pride, but did not see any reason to perform humility. The front is coming, Ephraim said. The pressure has been falling since Tuesday. The birds have gone. The horses will not face northwest. This will not be a 3-day blow price. This will be the kind of weather that kills people who think they are prepared. He mounted his mule at the entrance and looked down at Marion. I do not know if your warm hole will hold in what is coming, but I know your cabin will not. He rode south. The wind took his tracks within the hour. The warm chamber was ready for a cold night. Marion knew that. The platform was raised, the drainage groove was cut, the crib poles were shimmed. The entrance was sealed with boughs, poles, snow blocks, and the horse blanket with a fist-wide draft slit at the top. Food was stored in the cooler throat. Candle tests ran clean morning and evening. The thermometer read between 61 and 65 in the family chamber, depending on how many bodies occupied it and how long the lamp had been burning. But Marion also knew, and Jory knew, and Mara knew, that everything they had built had been tested by ordinary cold. 20 below, wind at 30 miles an hour, snow that fell and stopped and fell again. What Ephraim described was not ordinary cold. Jory sat outside the entrance on the 14th morning, watching the sky. He had a way of tipping his head back and closing his eyes, letting the pressure register through his sinuses and his bad ear, the ear that had been damaged by a blasting cap concussion in the Comstock years. He called it his weather ear, and he trusted it more than any barometer. The pressure is still falling, Jory said. The air tastes flat, no bite. The worst fronts do not announce themselves with snow first. They announce themselves with silence. He was right. The afternoon of January 11th was eerily still. The wind that had blown from the northwest for 2 weeks simply stopped. The sky was white, not gray, a blank expanse that looked less like clouds and more like the inside of a bowl. Chickens at the Asen place refused to leave the roost. Peter's cow stood in the corner of the barn with her head pressed into the wall. Marion set 3 markers inside the cave, a rag tied to a stick at the draft slit. If the rag pulled inward hard, cold air was forcing the cave to breathe differently. A candle on the floor of the entrance throat, if it leaned toward the warm seam, the air was still moving correctly. A cup under the warm drip on the back wall. If the drip slowed, the seam might be cooling or shifting upstream, which could mean a change in the chamber's temperature. If the rag pulls in, what does that mean? Mara asked. It means the wind outside is stronger than the cave's own draft. Cold air is pushing in instead of warm air pushing out. And then what? Then we watch the candle. If the candle still burns, the air is still safe, even if it is colder. If the candle dies, the air exchange has stopped and we open the entrance wider. Mara looked at the entrance. Opening the entrance wider meant letting the cold in. The entire shelter was built on the principle that the warm earth beat the cold sky, but that principle depended on the entrance remaining mostly sealed. Open the entrance wide enough to save the air, and you might lose the warmth. It is a balance, Jory said. Always. Underground, everything is a balance. Air and seal, heat and ventilation, safety and access. You do not solve it. You manage it. The sky did not change that evening. No snow fell. No wind blew. The thermometer outside the entrance read 12 above. The cave held at 63. The rag hung limp. The candle burned straight. The drip from the warm seam fell steady into the cup. Tamsin slept. Ivor slept. Mara read the Bible by lamplight and marked the page with a thread from her sewing kit. Jory sat in the entrance throat and listened to the silence and did not sleep. Marion sat beside him and did not sleep either. In the Comstock, Jory said very quietly, I was in the off-ear mine when the timber above us shifted. We could hear it creaking. Everyone ran. I ran. But one man stayed because he was counting his candles and he wanted to finish his count. The timber held. We ran for nothing. The man who stayed finished his count and walked out an hour later and told us we were fools. Was he right? He was alive. But he was not right. The timber held that time. The next time it did not. The man who stays to finish his count is a man who has decided the odds are in his favor. Underground, the odds are never in your favor. You do not bet on the rock being kind. You bet on yourself being ready when the rock is not. They sat in the entrance throat and listened to the silence and waited for the weather that was coming. January 12th, 1888 began with a lie. The morning was warm. Not warm the way the cave was warm, not 60 degrees and damp stone, but warm for January, warm for Idaho territory, warm enough that the snow on the south side of the basalt ridge began to soften, and the air had a quality that felt almost like early spring. Marion stepped outside the cave at dawn and felt the change immediately. His breath was still visible, but the air did not bite. The wind was light, from the south, carrying a gentleness that had no business existing in the second week of January on the Snake River plain. Jory felt it too. He stood outside the fissure with his head tipped back and his eyes closed and his bad ear turned toward the northwest. "This is wrong," Jory said. "It feels like a thaw." "It is not a thaw. A thaw comes slow. This came overnight. The pressure shifted south. Warm air is sitting on top of us, but the cold air is still there, behind it, to the north and west, and when the warm air lifts, the cold air comes under it like a door slamming." Marion looked at the sky. It was clear, blue, open. The kind of sky that invited a man to put down his tools and stand in the sun with his face turned upward. "How long?" Marion said. "Hours. Maybe less." "How bad?" Jory opened his eyes. "I cannot hear the birds," he said. "Not one bird since dawn. They know." The change came at 2 in the afternoon. Marion saw it first because he was outside, cutting boughs to reinforce the entrance. The northwest horizon, which had been clear all morning, turned dark. Not cloud dark, metal dark. A wall of color that looked less like weather and more like the edge of the world advancing, a band of iron gray that stretched from one end of the visible sky to the other and moved toward them with a speed that did not seem possible. The wind hit before the cloud. It came from the northwest in a single massive gust that knocked Marion sideways and threw loose snow off the basalt ridge in a horizontal sheet. The temperature dropped so fast that the air itself seemed to solidify. One breath was tolerable. The next breath cut his lungs. Marion dropped the boughs and dove for the entrance. He squeezed through the throat and hauled the bow door closed behind him, and the wind followed him in, a blast of cold that tore through the draft slit and hit the warm chamber like a fist. The temperature in the entrance throat dropped from 38 degrees to below 10 in less than a quarter hour. The rag at the draft slit did not lean inward. It snapped inward, pulled taut by the force of cold air rushing into the fissure. The candle on the floor guttered, leaned hard toward the warm seam, then steadied. The air was still moving, but it was moving fast now, the cave's own draft fighting the wind's draft for control of the entrance. "Seal it harder," Jory said. He was already moving, pulling snow blocks from the pile Marion had stacked inside the throat for exactly this purpose. They packed snow against the bow door, filling gaps, pressing blocks into the spaces between poles. They draped the horse blanket over the inside face and anchored it with stones. The wind screamed through the draft slit. The slit was 5 inches wide. It sounded like an animal. "Close it," Mara said. She was holding both children on the platform. Ivor was crying. Tamsin had her hands over her ears. "We cannot close it," Jory said. "Close the slit, and the cave stops breathing. The air goes bad within the hour." "Then make it smaller." Marion stuffed a rolled sock into the slit, reducing it to about 2 inches. The screaming dropped to a moan. The cold still came through, but slower. The entrance throat dropped to 5 degrees. The blanket wall between the throat and the family chamber held the warm zone at 58 degrees. 58. They had been at 63 that morning, 5 degrees lost in less than an hour, and the storm had barely started. "It will hold," Jory said. "The earth does not cool as fast as the air. The seam is still breathing. The stone holds heat that the air cannot steal." Marion pressed his hand against the warm wall. It was still warm. The steam still rose. The drip still fell into the cup. Whatever was happening in the sky, whatever Arctic catastrophe was descending on Camas Prairie, the basalt 2 feet behind the family chamber was connected to a heat source that did not care about weather. "How long can this last?" Mara said. "The storm or the warmth?" "Both." Jory looked at the warm wall, then at the entrance, then at the blanket that divided the two. "The storm, I do not know. Hours, days. The warmth." He put his bent hand on the stone. This heat has been here longer than any person alive. It will not stop because of one storm. At dark, the pounding came. Not wind, not rock. Human fists on the bow door, barely audible above the roar of the storm. Marion and Jory looked at each other. Opening the entrance meant losing the seal, losing the heat bank they had built, losing the difference between 58 degrees and the outside air, which was now so cold that the thermometer Marion had left on a rock ledge outside the fissure was unreadable. The alcohol column had contracted to a thin red line at the bottom of the tube. The pounding came again, and a voice, torn by wind, barely a word. "Price." Marion pulled the blanket aside. He pulled the snow blocks out. He hauled the bow door open. Cold hit the cave like a river breaking a dam. The entrance throat went from 5 degrees to something below measurement in seconds. Peter Asen stood in the entrance. He was holding Liv upright with one arm, and she was holding a child wrapped in a horse blanket. Peter's face was white on the left side, white with a waxy sheen that Marion recognized from Pennsylvania winters. Frostbite. The cheek, the ear, the jaw. Frozen. "The stove cracked," Peter said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except the fact. "Overfired. The iron split. The cabin filled with smoke. We have nothing." Marion pulled Liv inside. Jory took the child, a boy of 3, Peter's youngest, stiff and silent. Peter came last. Marion sealed the entrance behind them, snow blocks, boughs, blanket, everything, working fast because every second the entrance was open, the cave lost warmth that had taken days to accumulate. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next will test the only shelter these families have, and Marion is about to make a choice that puts all of it at risk. The cave held 7 people now: Marion, Mara, Tamsin, Ivor, Peter, Liv, and the Asen boy. The family chamber, 14 by 22 feet, was large enough for 7 bodies, but 7 bodies produced moisture and consumed air faster than 4. The candle on the floor burned shorter. Jory tested it every 30 minutes. Peter's face needed warmth, not cold. Mara pressed a damp cloth against his cheek. Warm water from the drip, wrung out, applied gently. Liv sat against the warm wall and held her boy and stared at the stone ceiling and said nothing. She had walked 2 miles in the storm carrying a child. She would not speak for 6 hours. Marion looked at Peter. 2 cords of fur, a better stove, a proper cabin. And here was Peter in the cave he had refused to enter, with a frostbitten face and a broken stove and a family that had nearly died between the cabin and the ridge. "Don't," Peter said, reading Marion's expression. Marion said nothing. "I know," Peter said. "I know." The warm chamber steadied at 56 degrees. 2 degrees lost from the opening. The drip from the seam continued. The candle burned. The air held. Then Peter said the thing that changed everything. "Noel Suter," Peter said. Beau's hired boy. He was between the barn and the road when the wind hit. I saw him from my door. He was walking north. Then I could not see anything. Noel Sutter was 16 years old. He worked for Beau feeding horses and loading freight. He slept in Beau's barn. He had been outside when the storm arrived. Marion looked at Jory. Jory looked at the entrance. Beyond the bow door and the snow blocks and the blanket, beyond the entrance throat and the fissure and the basalt ridge, the storm was producing a sound that was no longer wind. It was a continuous roar, without gusts, without breaks, without the rhythmic pulses that normal storms produced. It was the sound of air moving so fast and so cold that the distinction between wind and weather had ceased to exist. "You cannot go out in that," Jory said. "The boy is 16. And you have 2 children in here." Marion stood at the entrance throat. He could feel the cold through the bow door, through the snow blocks, through the blanket. It radiated like heat in reverse, a force that pulled warmth from everything it touched. Opening the entrance again would cost them another 2 degrees, 3 degrees. Every opening was a wound in the shelter that took hours to heal, but Noel Sutter was 16 years old and was somewhere between a barn and a road in a storm that was killing grown men with shelter. Marion tied the rope around his waist. He handed the other end to Jory. If I pull 3 times, I have him, and I am coming back. If I stop pulling, wait 10 minutes and then pull me back whether I answer or not. This is wrong, Jory said. You're risking the shelter for one person. The shelter is not worth anything if we close it. Jory held the rope, his bent hand wrapped around it, and his good hand braced against the crib pole, and he did not argue further because the argument was already lost. Marion was going. Marion pulled the seal apart, squeezed through the entrance, and stepped into the storm. He could not see. The distinction between air and snow had disappeared. He breathed and got ice. He opened his eyes and got white. The wind hit him from the northwest with a force that moved his entire body sideways, and he grabbed the basalt at the entrance and held on and tried to orient himself. The rope trailed behind him into the fissure, 20 feet of slack before it would pull taut. He moved down slope toward where the road should be, keeping one hand on the basalt. The rock was the only solid thing. The ground, the sky, the air. Everything was moving, everything was white, everything was cold beyond any temperature he had experienced. He found Noel's cap. It was frozen into a drift 50 feet from the entrance, pressed into the snow as if someone had stepped on it. The cap was wool, dark, with a leather brim. It was the kind of cap a 16-year-old boy would wear because his employer was too cheap to provide a proper hat. Marion pulled the cap free and looked around. Nothing. White in every direction. He called out. The wind took his voice and scattered it. He called again. Nothing. He had 60 feet of rope. He had used 40. He moved another 10 feet downslope, and the rope pulled taut behind him. He was at the limit. He stood at the end of his rope in a storm that was killing everything it touched, holding a frozen cap, and the boy was not there. He pulled 3 times. Pause. 3 times again. Then he turned back, following the rope hand over hand, and squeezed through the entrance and sealed it behind him, and stood in the cave with Noel Sutter's cap in his hand and ice in his lungs. Jory's face was tight. The candle went out while the entrance was open, he said. I relit it. It burns now, but shorter. Mara had the entrance sealed again before Marion could help. She worked with the stove poker, packing snow blocks into gaps, pressing the blanket flat, her hands red and fast. The entrance throat was 9 degrees. The family chamber was 53. 53. They were losing the balance. Every opening bled warmth. The seam was still producing heat, but the heat took time to accumulate, and the openings were coming too close together. Marion sat down. His hands were white. He could not feel his fingers. Mara took his hands and pressed them against the warm wall, and the heat entering his frozen skin felt like needles. Ivor was coughing again. The repeated blasts of cold air through the entrance had disrupted the chamber's humid warmth, and his chest tightened each time. Mara moved him to the rear of the chamber, close to the warm seam, but behind the stone barrier Marion had built after the burn. The stone radiated heat. Ivor's coughing eased. Tamsin sat on the platform with her book closed in her lap, and her eyes open and her face composed in the particular expression of a child who understands that the adults are frightened and has decided not to add to the problem. At 9 that night, the pounding came again. This time, Marion did not hesitate. He pulled the seal. He opened the entrance. He did not think about degrees or candle flames, or the balance between warmth and cold. Harlan Bow stood in the entrance with his daughter Cressa held against his chest. She was 14 years old, and her feet were bare. Her boots had come off in a drift between the store and the cellar, and she had walked the remaining distance on frozen ground in stockings, and by the time Bow reached her, the stockings were frozen to her skin, and her feet were the color of tallow. Bow looked at Marion. Marion looked at Bow. Between them lay 6 cords of undelivered firewood, $47 taken and not returned, a scheme to steal a claim, the word badger, the threat to take children, and the public mockery of a man who had dared to trust the earth instead of the economy that Harlan Bow controlled. She cannot walk, Bow said. Marion stepped aside. Bow carried Cressa into the cave. He did not thank Marion. He did not acknowledge the warm air, the platform, the crib poles, the drainage groove, the rope lines, the candle testing, the careful, patient labor that had turned a crack in the basalt into the only shelter between soldier and the ridge that could hold human life in this storm. He set Cressa on the platform and began pulling at her stockings, and Mara said, "Stop. Do not pull them. Warm water. Slow." Mara heated water in the cup from the drip, tested it against her wrist, and soaked a cloth. She wrapped Cressa's feet in the cloth and held them, and Cressa screamed when the warmth reached the frozen tissue. The cave now held 9 people. The entrance had been opened 3 times. The family chamber was 51 degrees and still falling. Jory watched the candle. It burned, low, but steady. The seam was still producing heat. The stone walls still held their thermal mass. The cave was losing the battle of the entrance, but the earth beneath the basalt was not losing anything. It was patient. It had been warm for longer than anyone in the cave had been alive, and it would be warm when they were all dead and the basalt was buried under 10 feet of snow. Marion sealed the entrance for the last time that night. He packed it tighter than it had ever been, leaving only a slit the width of his thumb. He watched the candle. It burned. Shorter, but it burned. By midnight, a woman arrived alone, a widow from a claim east of Pater's, half frozen, following the ridge by touch because she had heard from someone somewhere that there was warmth in the rock. Marion let her in. He sealed the entrance. The chamber dropped to 49 degrees. The candle burned. By 2 in the morning, 2 more arrived, a hired man and his partner, both from a ranch south of the ridge, both with hands and faces marked by frostbite. Marion let them in. He sealed the entrance. 13 people. 48 degrees in the family chamber. The candle on the floor burned with a flame the size of a fingernail. Jory tested the air at 3 heights and said, "It holds, but we are close." The entrance throat had iced. The steam from inside the cave met the cold air at the bow door and froze into a crust of ice that sealed the gaps Marion had left between the snow blocks. The slit was narrowing. Every hour, the ice built another fraction of an inch. Mara chipped it with the stove poker. That was why she had brought the stove poker. She stood in the entrance throat in air that was below zero and struck the ice from the inside of the door, opening the slit, letting fresh air in, saving the chamber's breath. She did this every hour through the night. Nobody asked her to. Nobody told her to. She saw the ice building, and she picked up the poker, and she kept the cave alive. By morning, the storm had not stopped, but the cave had held. 13 people lay in a chamber 14 by 22 feet. The warm seam still breathed. The drip still fell. The candle, replaced twice from Mara's dwindling supply, still burned. The thermometer, brought inside from the entrance where it was useless, read 47 degrees in the family chamber. Cold enough to see breath. Not cold enough to kill. Outside, the world was different. Ephraim Vale's hired man had died sometime in the night, found by morning less than 40 yards from a tool shed. He had been walking toward the shed when the storm erased his sense of direction, and he had walked in a circle and sat down in the snow with his back against a fence post and his hands in his lap, and the cold had taken him while he sat. A team of horses suffocated in a lean-to when the drift covered the opening and sealed them in. The temperature on Ephraim's porch, read at dawn by Ephraim himself from behind a barely open door, was 50 degrees below zero. The alcohol column in the thermometer had separated, which meant the actual temperature may have been lower. But in the cave, 13 people were alive. 2 had frostbite. 1 child was feverish but breathing. 1 girl's feet were wrapped in warm cloths, and she could feel pain, which meant the tissue was not dead. Marion sat in the entrance throat and listened to the wind, which was finally, after hours of monotone fury, beginning to gust instead of roar. Gusting meant pulses. Pulses meant the storm was breathing. A breathing storm was a storm that would eventually exhaust itself. He held the stove poker that Mara had used all night to keep the ice from sealing them in. The iron was cold in his hands. His hands were split and bleeding and numb. Behind him, 13 people breathed warm air that rose from a crack in the basalt that connected, through channels he would never see, to heat that the earth had held since before any of them existed. The cave had held. The earth had held. The entrance, the weakest point, the place where cold and warm fought for control, had held because Mara had stood in the throat every hour and struck the ice with a poker and refused to let it close. And Harlan Bow sat on the platform in the back of the chamber with his daughter's feet in his lap, and he did not speak, and he did not look at Marion, and the silence between them was the loudest thing in the cave. The storm broke on the morning of January 14th. It did not end so much as exhale, the wind dropping in stages, from roar to gust to moan to silence, over the course of 3 hours. By 10 in the morning, the air outside the fissure was still and so cold that it hurt to breathe, but the sky had cracked open along the southern horizon, and a blade of blue showed through the white. Marion opened the entrance. 13 people filed out of the cave into a world that looked nothing like the one they had entered. The snow had been reshaped. Ridges that had been knee-high were now buried under drifts the height of a man. Rocks that had been exposed were gone, swallowed. The landscape had been scraped and rebuilt by the wind, and every familiar marker, the draw, the track to the cabin, the line of the sage flat below, was erased. The cold was absolute. Frost formed on eyelashes within seconds of stepping outside. Mustaches froze. Breath crystallized and hung in the air like smoke from a gun. The sun, now visible through the crack in the southern sky, produced light but no warmth, a bright, useless, mocking presence that illuminated the damage without offering remedy. Nobody laughed. Marion noticed that. Over the past 2 weeks, when the word badger had traveled through soldier and the store and the wash bench, there had been laughter. Now 13 people stood outside a steaming crack in the basalt with frostbitten faces and frozen clothes, and the knowledge that the crack had kept them alive, and nobody laughed. Peter Assen looked at the ridge, then at the fissure, then at Marion. The frostbite on his left cheek had blistered overnight into a raised white patch that would scar. His boy was alive. His wife was alive. His cabin, 2 miles east, had a cracked stove and no heat. "I burned half a cord in 3 nights before the stove cracked," Peter said. Half a cord. 64 cubic feet of stacked fur, gone in 3 nights, and the cabin still could not hold. Marion had used lamp oil and 1 armload of kindling. The kindling burned outside the entrance to heat broth on the first morning. The cave's warmth had come from the earth. The earth had not consumed a single cord. The earth had not consumed anything. It had simply been warm, the way it had been warm before Marion arrived and would be warm after he was gone. Peter did not say Marion was right. He said, "Show me how you tested the air." Ephraim Vale arrived that afternoon. He rode his mule through drifts that reached the animal's belly, and he dismounted at the fissure entrance with the stiffness of a man whose body had been cold for so long that his joints had forgotten any other state. He did not ask permission. He walked into the cave, through the entrance throat with its crib poles and bow door, and the ice that Mara had chipped all night, into the family chamber where the platform and the drainage groove and the rope lines and the candle shelf and the food shelf and the red yarn and the warm wall were exactly as they had been, unchanged by the storm, unmarked by the catastrophe that had reshaped the world outside. Ephraim examined everything. He pressed the crib poles. He ran his finger along the drainage groove. He tested the slope of the platform by pouring water from the cup. He stood near the warm seam and held his hand over the steam and said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Marion, who had followed him in. "I told you a man with no cordwood in January has already chosen his grave," Ephraim said. "I was wrong. You found a warmer grave and turned it into a house." His voice was flat. He did not perform the admission. He delivered it the way he delivered all facts, as information, stripped of sentiment, offered because it was true and for no other reason. Then he asked questions. How did the air move? How hot was the seam? How deep did the second passage go? What was the drainage rate? How many people could the chamber hold before the air went bad? Marion answered what he could. Jory answered the rest. Mara answered the questions neither man thought to ask. Where the food stayed coolest without freezing, where blankets mildewed fastest, where children could sleep without rolling toward the warm wall, where the lamp smoke collected if the draft slowed. Ephraim listened to Mara with the same attention he gave Jory. This was unusual. Most men on the prairie listened to women about food, children, and cloth, and nothing else. Ephraim listened to Mara about ventilation patterns and food storage and the behavior of ice at the entrance because Mara had been the one chipping the ice every hour with a stove poker while 13 people slept. The entrance is the weakness, Ephraim said. We know, Jory said. It iced. If she had not cleared it, you would have lost the air. We know. Ephraim looked at Mara. How did you know to do that? I watched the slit getting smaller, Mara said. The ice was building from the steam. If the slit closed, the candle would die. If the candle died, I would not know whether the air was safe. So I kept the slit open. Ephraim nodded once. The rest of you were managing the heat, he said. She was managing the air. Both matter. The air matters more. He walked back to the entrance throat and stopped. He turned. I will be back, he said. I want to see how you build the entrance for next time. He did not say, if there is a next time. He said, for next time. The distinction was small and significant. Ephraim Vale had decided that the cave was a shelter worth improving, not a desperate act worth forgetting. Over the following week, families came to the ridge. They came in pairs and small groups, walking up the draw from the sage flat, following the track that Marion's boots had beaten into the snow over 2 weeks of hauling poles and cutting boughs. They came because they had heard, from Peter, from Ephraim, from the widow who had crawled to the fissure alone in the dark, that the cave was warm. They came because the storm had killed a man and suffocated horses and cracked stoves and buried cabins, and demonstrated, in the most direct language the frontier possessed, that a hard winter could destroy every conventional defense a family could build. They came with questions. How do you test a fissure? How do you know if the air is safe? How do you keep blankets dry? How do you store food in a cave without it spoiling? How do you keep children from wandering? How do you ventilate without losing heat? How do you know bad air from good air? Marion answered them at the entrance, standing beside the bow door with the warm air leaking out around him and the cold air pressing in. He demonstrated the candle test, floor, chest, near the seam. He showed the drainage groove and the slope principle. He showed the crib poles and explained the fracture in the entrance lip. He showed the red yarn line and the stone barrier near the warm seam. Jory stood behind him and added what Marion forgot or did not know. The sound test. Tap the ceiling stone lightly with a pick handle and listen. A solid ring meant sound rock. A dull thud meant loose material. A hollow answer meant a void above, which could be an air pocket or a fracture plane that might shed stone. Never trust a ceiling that dropped flakes after a freeze because water in the cracks expanded and loosened plates. Mara added what both men overlooked. Storage must be above the floor, not on it, because seep water would find anything at the lowest point. Lamp oil should be kept in the cooler zone, away from the warm seam, because heat thinned the oil and made it burn faster. Children needed a physical barrier, not just a verbal instruction. Rope line should be at child waist height, not adult waist height, because a child would walk under a rope they could not see in dim light. Marion refused payment. One man offered $25. Another offered a sack of cornmeal. Marion turned them both away, not out of generosity but out of something harder to name. The sense that the cave had been given, not built, and that charging for knowledge about it would transform a shelter into a commodity. He had watched Bo transform everything into a commodity: firewood, freight, credit, land. And the result was a community where a family could freeze while a storekeeper held their money. Jory disagreed. You cannot feed your children on principle, Jory said. They were outside the cave, alone, on the third day after the storm. Jory was coughing more than usual. The night in the cave, the repeated cold blasts from the entrance openings, the damp air, the exertion of holding the rope while Marion crawled into the blizzard, had settled into his chest and would not leave. "Take the cornmeal," Jory said. "Take the quarter, not as payment for the cave, payment for your time. You are teaching people skills that will save their lives. A teacher who starves cannot teach." Marion looked at Jory's bent hand resting on the basalt, the hand that had held the rope, the hand that had shimmed poles and scratched drainage grooves and tested candle flames at 3 heights. "You did not charge me," Marion said. "I did not teach you. I taught the cave. You happened to be inside it." Jory coughed. It was a longer cough than usual, and when it ended his breathing had a new sound, a faint whistle on the exhale that had not been there before. "Are you sick?" Marion said. "I have been sick since the Comstock," Jory said. "The question is never whether I'm sick. The question is whether I'm sick enough to stop." Harlan Bow did not wait long. On the 5th day after the storm, while Marion was teaching Pater the candle test inside the entrance throat, Bow rode up the draw on a borrowed horse. He did not dismount. He sat on the horse and looked at the fissure and the boot tracks and the path beaten into the snow by a dozen families, and his face had the particular tightness of a man who sees profit flowing in a direction he does not control. "Price," Bow called. Marion came to the entrance. Pater stood behind him. "I have been thinking about this cave," Bow said. "So have I. The cave is on your claim, maybe, but the underground is a different matter. Mineral rights. The fissure may contain mineral value. Steam, hot water, sulfur deposits. That is mineral ground, and mineral ground is governed by different rules than homestead ground." Marion said nothing. "I have filed a notice with the land office in Haley," Bow said. "A claim of interest in the mineral potential of the fissure and associated underground passages. Until that claim is adjudicated, any person entering the cave does so at their own risk, and any person charging for access to the cave is engaged in commerce on disputed mineral ground. I am not charging anyone. You are permitting entry. That is access. Access to mineral ground without authorization is trespass." Pater spoke from behind Marion. "The cave saved your daughter's feet, Bow." Bow's horse shifted. Bow held the reins tight. "My daughter's feet are my concern," Bow said. "The mineral rights are the territory's concern. I am doing what any responsible citizen would do. An unregulated cave with geothermal activity is a hazard. Someone has to manage it." "Manage it," Marion said, "or own it. There is no difference." Bow turned the horse and rode back toward Soldier. The hoof prints filled with blown snow within the hour. Marion stood at the entrance and watched the track disappear. Beside him, Pater said, "He will not stop. He cannot allow something valuable to exist that he does not control." "Then he will have to take it," Marion said, "because I will not give it." The weeks after the storm were the weeks of Jory Penrose. Not because Jory made himself important, he was the least self-promoting man Marion had ever met, but because the work that needed to be done was his kind of work, and he did it the way he had done everything underground, slowly, carefully, and with the conviction that the rock would punish any shortcut. They mapped the first 2 chambers together. Jory held the rope, and Marion paced the distances, calling out numbers that Mara recorded on a piece of brown paper with a charcoal pencil. The family chamber, 14 feet at its widest, 22 feet long, ceiling between 6.5 and 7.5 feet. The entrance throat, 27 inches at the squeeze, 6 feet long. The passage to the second chamber, 30 feet at a steep downward angle, narrowing to 18 inches at one point where Marion had to turn sideways and exhale to fit through. The second chamber, 10 by 12 feet, ceiling 9 feet, floor too hot for extended standing. Candle burned shorter there. The air was marginal, breathable for minutes, but not for hours. Steam thicker. Mineral deposits heavier on the walls, white and yellow crusts that Jory scraped with a knife and smelled and said, were calcium and sulfur, neither lethal in ventilated air, but both warnings that the source below was chemically active. "We do not use the second chamber," Jory said. "We know it is there. We know it is hot. We leave it alone. If the family chamber ever fails, if the seam shifts, if the main vent closes, the second chamber is a reserve. But nobody goes there without a rope and a watcher." Mara added her own intelligence to the map. She marked where food stored best, the cooler entrance zone, on the shelf Jory had carved, where the air was cold enough to preserve, but not cold enough to freeze solid. She marked where blankets mildewed, the floor near the warm wall, where moisture from the seam condensed on fabric and turned it damp within a day. She marked where sick people should lie, near the warm wall but above the seep line, where the warmth helped breathing without the wet reaching bedding. Jory watched her work and said, "In the mines, the men who understood ventilation kept the others alive. The men who understood water kept the equipment running. The women who understood storage kept the camp fed. You are doing all three." Mara did not respond to the compliment. She asked instead, "What happens when the spring thaw comes? If the snow melts above us, where does the water go?" Jory looked at the ceiling. He looked at the cracks where moisture already formed. He looked at the drainage groove, which was designed for the warm seep, not for meltwater from above. "That," he said, "is the next problem." Jory taught Marion to listen to rock. They sat together in the family chamber on a February morning, the cave quiet, the lamp turned low, and Jory tapped the ceiling with a pick handle, a sharp, clean ring. "Sound rock," Jory said. "The column is solid, no fractures, no voids." He moved 2 feet to the left and tapped again. A duller note, shorter, with a slight afterbuzz. "Looser. Not dangerous yet. But the joint between the columns is wider here. Water gets in, freezes, expands. In 5 years, 10 years, that section sheds a plate. You will not be under it because you will tap this ceiling every spring and you will hear the sound change." Marion tapped. He heard the difference. Sharp and dull, solid and loose. The rock was speaking, and the language was simple once you knew what to listen for. "What about the entrance lip?" Marion said. "The fracture. Will the crib poles hold?" "The crib poles will hold for now. The fracture is stable, but it is not healed. Every freeze cycle pushes it wider. In 2 winters, maybe 3, you will need to timber the entrance properly. Square sets, keyed into the rock on both sides with a cap log across the top. That is Comstock work. I will show you." He did not show him, not then. The cough was worse. Jory sat down after the ceiling test and breathed in the particular way of a man whose lungs no longer had the capacity they once had, a shallow, measured rhythm that rationed air the way a thirsty man rations water. Marion watched and said nothing, because Jory had told him the question was never whether he was sick, but whether he was sick enough to stop, and Marion did not want to be the person who suggested stopping. They disagreed once. Marion wanted to widen the entrance throat, chip away at the narrowest point, the 27-inch squeeze, to make it easier to pass supplies and people through. Jory forbade it. "The narrow point is a feature, not a flaw," Jory said. "The squeeze limits airflow. If you widen it, you increase the exchange between warm air inside and cold air outside. The cave stays warm because the entrance is small. Make the entrance bigger and you make the cave colder. But if we need to get people through quickly, the storm, the openings, the cold blasts, then you manage the openings. You open fast and seal fast. You do not redesign the entrance because one night was difficult. One night is always difficult. The entrance will serve you for 100 nights if you leave it alone." Marion yielded. He did not want to. The squeeze had scraped his ribs raw and slowed every entry and exit, and turned the simple act of carrying a child into the cave into a contortion exercise. But Jory had spent 40 years underground, and Marion had spent 2 weeks, and the ratio was not close. Spring came the way spring comes to the high desert of southern Idaho, reluctantly, in stages, with setbacks that tested every person who had begun to believe the worst was over. March brought mild days and freezing nights. The snow on the ridge softened in the afternoons, and refroze in black crusts by evening. Water began to move, not the warm seep from inside the cave, which ran year-round, but meltwater from above, finding its way through cracks in the basalt that had been frozen shut since November. The family chamber dripped, first in one place, then three, then a dozen points across the ceiling where meltwater seeped through fractures and fell onto the platform, the blankets, the food stores, and the floor. The drainage groove Jory had cut could not handle the volume. Water pooled. The floor that had been damp became wet. The wet floor became a shallow sheet of standing water that crept toward the sleeping platform and the supply shelf. Marion applied Jory's lesson. Water remembers the lowest place. He cut a second drainage channel, wider and deeper than the first, angling from the center of the chamber toward the entrance throat, where the water could run outside. He laid flat stones along the warm wall to create a splash barrier that kept the seep water separated from the meltwater. He raised the supply shelf another 4 inches by shimming with rocks. Mara moved the bedding to the highest ground in the chamber, the raised section along the left wall, and covered it with the oiled canvas Jory had provided. She built a makeshift plank walk from sled runners between the sleeping area and the entrance so the children could cross the wet floor without soaking their feet. These were Jory's principles applied by Marion's hands. Raise everything above the water, channel the water toward the exit, separate the warm seep from the cold melt. Protect what matters most, people and food, and let the stone be wet. Jory could not help. By late February, his cough had worsened to the point where the walk from Soldier to the ridge left him breathless and gray-faced. He came twice in March, staying only hours before the cave's damp air triggered coughing fits that bent him double. The night he had spent holding the rope during the blizzard, the cold blasts through the entrance, the exertion of the crisis. It had accelerated what the Comstock had started. His lungs were failing. The secondary crisis came in the third week of March, 1889, more than a year after the Great Storm. A warm rain fell on snowpack that had been building since November. The combination was dangerous in the way that only mountain country understands. Snow absorbs rain like a sponge until it reaches saturation, and then the entire mass begins to move, not as avalanche, but as water, a slow, relentless flood that fills every low point and channel and crack. The cave entrance flooded ankle deep. The warm seam through fog so thick that the lamp was barely visible from the sleeping platform. The drainage channels Marion had cut could not handle the volume of water coming through the ceiling cracks and the entrance at the same time. The family chamber, which had been 63 degrees and dry on a good winter day, was now 55 degrees and standing in 2 inches of water. At the same time, a child from a claim near Crichton disappeared on the ridge. A boy of 9, driving 2 goats along the basalt, had gone into one of the many small cracks and openings that dotted the ridge. His father found the goat standing outside a fissure 200 yards south of Marion's cave, bleeding. The boy was not with them. The father came to Marion because there was nobody else. Jory was in Soldier, too sick to ride. Ephraim was 65 and his knee would not allow him into a crawl space. Petter knew the candle test but had never been deeper than the family chamber. Marion was the only person on the North Prairie who had been underground, who understood how fissures worked, who knew how to tie off and mark turns and test air and listen to rock. He did not want to go. The fissure the boy had entered was not his cave. He had never explored it. He did not know its air, its structure, its temperature, its hazards. Going into an unknown fissure during a thaw, with water running through the basalt and fog obscuring everything, was exactly the kind of decision that Jory would have forbidden. But the boy was 9, and Marion could hear Jory's voice saying, "You do not bet on the rock being kind. You bet on yourself being ready when the rock is not." He took the rope, the candle, the pick handle, and a dry blanket. He tied off at the entrance of the unfamiliar fissure and squeezed inside. The passage was narrower than his cave and colder. No warm seam here. This was an ordinary basalt crack, not connected to the geothermal source that heated his own chamber. The air was damp and cold and moved slowly. His candle burned clean at all three heights, which meant the air was safe, but the flame leaned away from him, which meant the draft was pulling inward, not pushing outward. Different airflow, different structure. The water was the problem. Meltwater ran through the fissure in a stream that deepened with every yard. By the time Marion had gone 30 feet, it was past his ankles and rising. By 50 feet, it was at his knees and moving fast enough to push against his legs. He could hear the boy. Faintly, through the rock, a thin, high sound that might have been crying or might have been water echoing in a void. He could not tell direction. Sound in a fissure bounced and distorted and lied. Jory's rule, water remembers the lowest place. Marion stopped. He looked at the water running past his legs. It was flowing inward, deeper into the fissure, downhill. If the boy had gone deep, he would be in the lowest point, and the lowest point was where the water was going. The water would find the boy before Marion would. Instead of pushing deeper, Marion cut a temporary channel. He used the pick handle to pry a flat stone from the fissure wall at the entrance, creating an opening in the lip that let the water drain outward instead of pooling inward. The water level inside the fissure began to drop. Slowly, an inch in 5 minutes, another inch in 10 now, but dropping. Then he followed the draft, not the sound. The draft pulled inward, which meant air was entering the fissure from outside and flowing to a point where it exited through another crack. If the boy was in a pocket with air still moving, the draft would lead to him. If the boy was in a dead pocket with no air movement, the draft would lead past him, and Marion would have to double back. He followed the draft for 40 feet beyond the waterline, into a dry side passage that angled upward and to the right. The air was cooler here. The candle burned brighter, more oxygen, less moisture. He called out. A voice came back, thin, scared, but clear. I am here. The boy was in a cold side pocket, a small chamber no bigger than a closet, where a crack in the ceiling admitted enough air to breathe and enough light to see by. A thin gray glow, barely visible, but proof that the surface was close. He had gone in chasing a goat that had entered ahead of him, and when the water rose, he had climbed upward into the pocket and stayed there. Marion wrapped him in the blanket, tied the rope around both of them, and led him out through the drained passage. Outside, the boy's father was on his knees in the mud. If this story makes you think about the knowledge that saves lives, the kind that cannot be bought, only learned and passed on, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Marion walked back to his own cave that afternoon, soaked to the waist and shaking. He sat on the platform in the family chamber and felt the warm wall at his back and thought about what he had done. He had not used Jory's rules perfectly, he had improvised. The channel at the entrance, the decision to follow the draft instead of the sound, those were adaptations, not lessons. But the principles underneath them were Jory's. Water remembers the lowest place. Air moves for a reason. Test before you trust. The rules had entered him deeply enough that when the situation demanded something Jory had not specifically taught, Marion could build a new response from the foundations Jory had laid. He had moved beyond student. He knew it, and the knowledge sat in him with a weight that was partly pride and partly grief, because the reason he had needed to go alone was that the teacher was dying. Jory Penrose died on the 4th of April, 1889, in his room behind the stable in Soldier. He died the way many Comstock men died, not underground, not in a collapse or a gas pocket or a flood, but in a bed, with his lungs full of the accumulated damage of 40 years of rock dust and bad air, and the particular poison that deep mines breathe into the men who work them. Marion was with him. He had ridden to Soldier when Peter brought word that Jory had not been seen outside the stable for 2 days. He found Jory in the narrow room, lying on a cot with his bent hand resting on his chest and his breathing reduced to a shallow, rapid flutter that barely moved the blanket. Jory's eyes were open. He saw Marion. "The thaw," Jory said. His voice was a whisper pushed through damaged tissue. The ceiling cracks. Did the water come through? It came through. I handled it. The drainage? Second channel, wider, angled toward the entrance. The platform? Raised another 2 inches, oiled canvas over the top. Jory closed his eyes. His bent hand moved on his chest, the fingers curling and uncurling in a rhythm that looked like they were testing something. The density of the air, the weight of the blanket, the last remaining grip on a world that was slipping out of reach. "The boy in the fissure," Jory said. "Peter told you." "The boy in the fissure. You followed the draft, not the sound." The sound lied. The draft moved. "Good." The word came out as breath, not voice. "Do not trust warm air. Test it." He reached beside the cot and picked up a brass candle shield, a small, battered piece of curved metal that clipped onto a candle to protect the flame from side drafts. It was the kind of tool that Comstock miners carried in their belts, worn smooth by decades of handling. Jory held it out. Marion took it. Jory died that evening. The stableman found him at dusk, hand still open where the candle shield had been. The ridge above Camas Prairie held its heat through the night, as it always did, as it had done before Jory Penrose arrived and would do long after the last person who remembered him was gone. The steam rose from the fissure in a thin white thread, and the stars turned overhead, and the basalt was warm. Marion taught the first public lesson at the cave 3 days after Jory's funeral. 7 families came. He stood at the entrance with Jory's brass candle shield clipped to a tallow candle and said, "Before anyone enters, everyone tests. Floor, chest, near the seam. If you cannot tell me what the flame is doing and why, you do not go in." He made every adult test the candle before entering. One man held it too high. Marion corrected him. One woman held it too close to the entrance draft, and the flame leaned from the wind, not from bad air. Marion showed her how to shield the flame and read the lean without the draft distorting it. Tamsin, who was now 8 and had lived in the cave longer than any person except her parents, stood beside the red yarn line and told the younger children, "You do not cross this rope. The rock behind it is too hot. If you touch it, it burns. I will know if you cross it because I will see you, and if I do not see you, my mother will." The children looked at Tamsin the way children look at another child who has authority they do not understand. She was thin, serious, and unafraid of the dark, and she spoke with the certainty of someone who had spent a winter underground and emerged with knowledge that adults came to her cave to learn. Mara organized a shelf ledger. She hung it from a peg driven into a crack in the cave wall, a piece of brown paper, replaced monthly, on which she recorded the inventory of the community stores. Lamp oil, dry socks, oat sacks, spare mittens, matches, candles, blankets. Every item that entered the cave was marked. Every item that left was marked. The ledger was not Marion's idea. It was not Jory's. It was the contribution of a woman who understood that survival without order was just a slower kind of chaos. Marion placed Jory's brass candle shield on the cave shelf beside the ledger. It sat there, small and battered and bright, a piece of metal that had traveled from Cornwall to the Comstock, to the Snake River Plain, carried by a man who had spent his life underground and had given his last useful object to a man who was still learning to listen to rock. Bo did not stop. The mineral rights claim sat with the land office in Haley, unadjudicated, a piece of paper that accomplished nothing legally but everything socially. It created doubt. Families who came to the cave wondered whether they were trespassing. Men who wanted to contribute supplies wondered whether the supplies would be seized. The claim did not need to succeed. It only needed to exist, casting a shadow over the cave's status that made people hesitate. Then Bo found a more effective weapon. He told people that the cave gases had killed Jory Penrose. It was not entirely a lie. Jory had died of lung disease, and the cave's damp air had aggravated his cough during the winter. Geothermal fissures could produce gases, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, that concentrated in enclosed spaces and damaged lungs. Bo did not invent the risk. He amplified it. He told people that the cave's warmth came at a cost, that the steam carried poison, that Jory had been a strong man reduced to a corpse by the very air Marion was inviting families to breathe. The accusation stung because it was partly plausible. Marion could not prove that the cave air had not harmed Jory. He could only say that the candle tests ran clean, that 13 people had survived a night in the chamber without respiratory damage, that the draft moved continuously, that the air at the 3 test heights burned yellow and steady. But Beau's version was simpler and more frightening. The cave kills. 3 words against a paragraph of explanation. Fear traveled faster than evidence. Some families stopped coming. The ones who came arrived with questions about gas and poison and long-term exposure. Marion answered them patiently. He demonstrated the candle test. He showed the draft slit. He explained that the air moved because the warm seam pushed it and the cold entrance pulled it, and as long as both forces worked, the chamber breathed fresh. Peter, who had doubted the cave more than anyone and now defended it more fiercely, brought his own evidence. His family had spent 6 nights in the cave during the January blow. His boy, who had been 3 and fragile, was now 4 and running. His wife Liv, who had been carried half frozen to the entrance, was healthy. His own frostbite had healed under the cave's consistent warmth faster than it would have healed in a drafty cabin with temperature swings. Beau's daughter walks on both feet because of that cave, Peter said to anyone who would listen. Ask Beau whether the cave killed her too. The community split. Not evenly. Most families trusted Marion, or at least trusted the evidence of the storm, but the split existed, and Beau fed it the way a man feeds a fire he wants to keep smoldering. Marion could not fight Beau with words. He was not a speaker, not a politician, not a man who could stand in Beau's store and command attention. He fought with the only weapon he had, continued competence. Every family that came to the cave received the same teaching. Every candle test ran clean. Every winter, the cave held warmth, and the families who used it survived. The earth did not argue. It simply stayed warm. And over time, the warmth won more arguments than Beau's words could lose. By the autumn of 1889, the cave that Marion Price had crawled into, half dead and terrified, had become something the North Prairie did not have a proper name for. It was not a house. It was not a mine. It was not a church or a store or a school, though it functioned at various moments as all of these. The families who used it called it the Warm Rock Room, and the name stuck because it described exactly what it was, a room made of warm rock belonging to no one and available to anyone who learned the rules. The rules were posted. Marion had resisted posting them. Rules on paper felt like something Beau would do, turning a shared shelter into an institution with regulations. But Mara had insisted, and Mara was right. Without posted rules, every new family required the same 30-minute explanation. With rules chalked on a flat stone propped against the entrance wall, the explanation took 5 minutes, and the remaining 25 could be spent on the candle test. The rules read, no lamp beyond the second rope, no child without a hand, no sealed door. 9 words. Jory would have approved. He had always said that the best instructions in a mine were the ones short enough to shout in a collapse. Beneath the 9 words, in smaller writing, Mara had added practical details. Test the candle at 3 heights before entering. Report any change in the flame to Marion or Mara Price. Do not touch the back wall beyond the stone barrier. Do not enter the second passage for any reason. Store all supplies on the shelf above the waterline. Mark the ledger when adding or removing items. Replace any candle you use. The cave now had 3 marked chambers, though only 1 was used. The family chamber, 14 by 22 feet, warm seam along the back wall, sleeping platform along the left, supply shelf on the right, drainage grooves in the floor, crib poles in the entrance throat. The second chamber, the hot deep room Jory had declared forbidden, remained roped off, its passage marked with charcoal crosses that meant danger. The entrance zone, the throat and the area immediately inside the bow door, served as the transition space, the airlock between warm interior and cold exterior that Marion had learned through 2 winters was the most critical part of the entire system. The entrance had been improved. Marion had timbered it properly in the summer of 1889, using the square set method Jory had described but never demonstrated. 2 vertical posts keyed into notches chipped in the basalt on either side of the throat, a cap log across the top, resting in the notches, bearing the weight of the fractured lip that had worried Jory since the first day. Cross braces at waist height on both sides. The whole assembly was tight enough that Marion could hang from the caplog without movement, and strong enough that the freeze-thaw cycles of 2 more winters did not shift it. Outside the entrance, Marion had built a vestibule from stacked snow blocks and sage boughs, renewed every November. The vestibule served as a windbreak, a storage area for wet boots and outer clothing, and a buffer zone that reduced the thermal shock of entering or leaving. A man stepping from 63-degree cave air into -20 wind risked the kind of lung spasm that could drop him in the snow. The vestibule, holding at perhaps 10 or 15 degrees above zero, gave the body a chance to adjust. Ephraim Vale, who had once told Marion that a man with no cordwood had chosen his grave, became the strictest enforcer of the cave rules. This was not a conversion born of sentiment. It was born of the same pragmatism that had made Ephraim a good road boss for 30 years. He had seen what worked. The cave worked. The rules kept it working. Therefore, the rules mattered, and anyone who violated them was threatening the system that kept people alive. Ephraim stationed himself at the entrance on bad weather days, the days when families from outlying claims arrived at the ridge with frost-whitened faces and children wrapped in horse blankets. And he checked every candle test personally. If a man held the candle wrong, Ephraim corrected him. If a child tried to enter without holding an adult's hand, Ephraim stopped the child and looked at the parent with the flat, judgmental gaze that had terrified freight drivers for 3 decades. "The cave does not forgive carelessness," Ephraim told anyone who would listen. "The rock is warm. The rock is also heavy. The steam is comforting. The steam also carries what you cannot smell. The rules exist because men died learning them." He meant Jory. He never said Jory's name in these speeches, but everyone knew. 2 freight wagons began carrying extra boughs and canvas in winter, lashed to the running gear alongside the regular freight. This was Ephraim's doing. He convinced the teamsters that emergency shelter materials cost nothing to carry and could mean the difference between a dead customer and a live one, and dead customers did not order freight. 6 neighboring claims built storm cellars or dugout airlocks based on Marion's teachings. Not all of them had access to geothermal warmth. The warm fissure was a geological anomaly, a specific gift of the basalt and the volcanic heat beneath it. But all of them applied the principles Marion taught: raised sleeping surfaces, double entrances, ventilation slits, candle tests, drainage grooves, shared emergency stores. The storm cellar that Peter Assen built on his own claim was the closest adaptation. He dug into a south-facing hillside, lined the floor with flat stones, raised the sleeping platform on log sections, and built a double-door entrance with a canvas curtain between the doors. It held at 35 degrees on the coldest nights. Not warm, not comfortable, but survivable without burning a single stick of wood. Peter credited Marion. Marion credited Jory. Jory was dead, and the credit settled on his memory the way snow settled on the ridge, quietly and in layers. Teaching became the center of Marion's life in a way that mining coal and hauling freight and proving homestead improvements never had. He did not seek it. People came. They arrived at the ridge with specific problems: a drafty cabin, a cracked stove, a root cellar that flooded every spring, and Marion walked their claims with them and looked at their structures and told them what the rock and the water and the air were doing, and what could be done about it. He taught the way Jory had taught him, through action, not lecture. He did not stand in front of a group and explain principles. He walked to the problem, put his hand on the wall, felt the temperature, watched the moisture, listened to the draft, and said, "Here, this is where the heat leaves. This is where the water enters. This is where the air stalls." The people who came were not students in any formal sense. They were farmers, ranchers, freighters, wives, children, hired men, people whose expertise was in growing things, moving things, feeding things, and keeping things alive through conditions that punished every mistake. They did not need theory. They needed someone to show them where the crack was and how to fill it. Marion showed them, and in showing them, he discovered something about himself that 7 years of coal mines and freight roads and homestead labor had not revealed. He was good at this. Not good the way Jory had been good, Jory's knowledge was deep, geological, born of decades underground. Marian's knowledge was practical, translational, born of the specific experience of nearly freezing to death and finding a way not to. He could stand on a man's claim and see the cabin the way the winter saw it, every gap, every short stovepipe, every missing windbreak, because he had lived inside that failure and knew its exact cost. Mara taught alongside him. Not the rock and the air, those were Marian's domain, but the order and the preparation that turned survival into something sustainable. She taught women how to organize winter stores so that the most critical supplies were accessible without exposing the rest to cold or moisture. She taught the shelf and ledger system she had developed in the cave. Everything inventoried, everything in its place, everything above the waterline. She taught children to recognize the signs of frostbite on each other's faces, the waxy white patches on cheeks and ears that a child might not feel on their own skin but could see on a friend's. The partnership between Marian and Mara was not a romance in the way that stories require romance. No courtship, no declaration, no single moment of recognition. It was the partnership of two people who had entered a crack in the ground with two sick children and no fuel, and had, through separate and complementary intelligence, made the crack livable. Marian understood the cave. Mara understood the people in it. Together they had managed 13 lives through the worst night any of them had experienced, and the management had been so seamless that most of the 13 did not realize even afterward that they had been managed at all. Their marriage deepened not through words but through the daily labor of shared purpose. Marian handled stone and air. Mara handled supplies and rules and the human logistics of a shelter that served more families every winter. They argued about the entrance width. Marian still wanted to widen it. Mara agreed with Jory that the narrow squeeze was a feature. And about the ledger, Marian thought the inventory was excessive. Mara showed him the lamp oil consumption figures, and he stopped arguing. And about the children, who were growing up half underground and needed, Mara insisted, to be educated in something beyond candle tests and drainage grooves. Tamsin learned to read the cave ledger before she could read a newspaper. She knew the inventory of the warm rock room the way other children knew their multiplication tables. By heart, by feel, by the particular satisfaction of a system that worked because someone maintained it. She was 9 when she first conducted a candle test for a visiting family without her parents present, holding the flame at 3 heights with the steadiness of a child who had grown up in lamplight and knew what the flame meant. Ivor survived. His chest remained weak. The cough that had started in December 1887 never fully left him, returning in cold weather with a rattle that Mara listened for the way a sailor listens for wind. But he survived, and the cave's warmth was the reason. The consistent 60-degree air in the family chamber had kept his lungs from the repeated freeze and thaw cycles that killed weak chests in drafty cabins. The cave had not cured him. It had given his body the stable warmth it needed to fight, and his body had fought. The resolution of Harland Bow came not from Marian and not from the community, but from the person Bow least expected. It happened in the church in Soldier, during a meeting called to discuss winter preparations for the coming season. Bow attended because any meeting that discussed resources was a meeting that affected his business. He sat in the second row with his hat on his knee, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who intended to speak at length about the dangers of unregulated cave access. He did speak. He stood and repeated the arguments he had been making for 2 years. The cave was on disputed mineral ground. The gases were dangerous. Jory Penrose had died of lung disease aggravated by cave exposure, and the community needed a responsible party, by which he meant himself, to manage access and ensure safety. He spoke for 5 minutes. He was persuasive in the way that men with money and repetition are persuasive, not because the argument was strong, but because the argument was familiar and the man making it controlled the store accounts. Then Cressa Bow stood up. She was 16. She had not spoken publicly about the storm. She had not spoken publicly about her feet, which had healed with the loss of 2 toes on the left foot, the small toe and the one beside it, taken by frostbite that the cave's warmth had stopped from spreading but could not reverse. She walked with a slight limp that she had learned to disguise, and she wore boots a half size larger on the left foot to accommodate the scarring, and she had not, until this moment, said a word about any of it in a room where anyone could hear. "My father," Cressa said, "brought me to that cave with my feet frozen. Marion Price opened the door. He did not ask my father for money. He did not ask my father for an apology. He did not ask my father for the 6 cords of firewood he paid for and never received." The church was silent. Beau's face went still. "Mara Price wrapped my feet in warm cloths and held them for 2 hours. I screamed. She held them. The cave was warm enough that the frostbite stopped spreading. If I'd stayed in my father's store cellar, I would have lost both feet to the knee. The doctor in Haley told me that when I asked. He said the consistent warmth was the difference between toes and legs." She looked at her father. "This cave did not kill Jory Penrose. 40 years of mining killed Jory Penrose. The cave kept 13 people alive on a night when a man died 40 yards from a shed. My father knows this. He was one of the 13. She sat down. The church remained silent for a long time. Beau did not speak again at the meeting. He did not stand. He did not leave. He sat in the second row with his hat on his knee and his face the color of a man who has been struck by something he cannot hit back. Beau's conversion was not instant, not complete, and not graceful. He did not apologize to Marion. He did not return the $47. He did not publicly retract the mineral rights claim, though he stopped pressing it with the land office, and the claim lapsed a year later for lack of action. What he did was smaller, and in its way, more honest. He withdrew the complaint. He donated 2 barrels of lamp oil to the cave's community stores, delivered to the ridge by his own freighter without invoice or comment. He instructed his teamsters to carry emergency boughs and canvas alongside Ephraim's wagons, and he never again charged for emergency freight in winter, a policy that cost him money and that he explained to no one. When Pater asked Beau about the change, months later, outside the store in Soldier, Beau said, "I still say a hole is no proper house, but I've seen a proper house kill faster." It was the closest he would come to admission. It was enough. The community heard it, and the hearing was the end of the argument. The years after Beau's retreat were the years of expansion, though expansion is too grand a word for what happened. The Warm Rock Room did not become an institution. It did not become a business or a landmark or a point of civic pride. It became what it had always been, more fully, a place where families went when the weather or their circumstances demanded warmth they could not produce on their own. By 1892, the cave had its 3 marked chambers, its timbered vestibule, its snow block wall renewed every November, and its posted rule: no lamp beyond the second rope, no child without a hand, no sealed door. Marion maintained it, Mara inventoried it, Ephraim enforced it, and every winter families came. Some came for single nights, a storm blowing in too fast, a stove failing, a cabin roof collapsing under snow weight. Some came for weeks, a family burned out, a widow with no fuel, a hired man with frostbite too severe to work. The cave held them all, not because Marion was generous. He would have said he was only practical, but because the cave's warmth was not his to withhold. It came from the earth. It had been there before him. It would be there after him. He was the keeper, not the owner, and the distinction mattered to him in a way he could not fully explain, but felt deeply enough that no amount of Beau's pressure or community expectation could change it. Marion proved the claim. He added a better cabin in the spring of 1890, larger than the first, with a proper stone chimney, full chinking, and a longer stovepipe. Mara planted currant bushes near the spring where the basalt met the sage flat, and they grew in the warmth that seeped through the ground and produced fruit in August that tasted sharper than anything she had grown in Pennsylvania. They never moved fully out of the ridge in winter. The cabin was home from April to October. From November to March, they slept in the Warm Rock Room, not because they had to, not because the cabin was inadequate, but because the cave was warmer, and the children had grown up in it, and the ridge felt more like home than the sage flat below. Tamsin grew into the person who could read the cave ledger better than anyone. At 12, she conducted inventories alone, chalking figures on the supply stone with a confidence that visitors mistook for arrogance and that Mara recognized as competence. By 14, she taught the candle test to new families while Marion watched from the entrance, adding nothing, because there was nothing to add. Ivor carried his weak chest into adulthood. He could not haul stone or chop wood for long without the cough returning, and the limitation shaped his life toward tasks that used his hands and his mind rather than his lungs. He carved. He repaired. He kept the drainage grooves clear with a pick point and a patience that resembled Jory's. He never entered the second chamber. He did not need to. The family chamber was his world, and its warmth was personally, medically, irreplaceably his. Marion Price died in the winter of 1903 at the age of 51. He did not die in the deep cave or in a storm or from the gases that Beau had warned about. He died from a fall while repairing the outer vestibule. A snowblock wall had shifted after a heavy accumulation, and Marion climbed to the top to reposition the blocks, and his boot slipped on the ice that formed wherever the cave's warm steam met the cold air outside, and he fell backward onto the basalt. The fall broke his hip and 2 ribs, and the cold reached him before Mara could bring help, and the combination of shock and exposure took him before the doctor from Haley could arrive. He died on the ridge, within sight of the fissure entrance, with the steam rising behind him and the snow falling around him, and Mara holding his hand in the particular grip of a woman who had held frostbitten feet and sick children, and chipped ice with a stove poker, and organized the survival of 13 people, and was now holding the one person she could not save. Mara kept the ledger for 11 more years, until her hands shook too much to hold the charcoal. She wrote smaller as the tremor worsened, the figures shrinking on the brown paper until Tamsin took over and wrote in her mother's place. The brass candle shield remained on the cave shelf, beside the ledger, tarnished now but still functional, a piece of metal that had traveled from Cornwall to Nevada to Idaho and had outlasted the 2 men who carried it. 23 people learned Marion's rules directly over the winters that followed the Great Storm. Not all of them found geothermal warmth. The fissure on the North Ridge was a geological accident, a gift of basalt and deep heat that could not be replicated by effort or intention. But all of them built something from what Marion taught: storm cellars with raised platforms, root cellars with ventilation slits, dugout airlocks with double doors and canvas curtains, candle tests before entering any enclosed space. The method spread as a discipline, not a miracle. The specific warmth was rare. The knowledge that kept people alive inside it was transferable, and it transferred. Marion and Mara lived out their later years on the claim above Camas Prairie, the claim that Harlan Beau had tried to take and that the earth beneath it had made worth keeping. The cabin improved. The currant bushes grew. The mule was replaced by a second mule and then by a horse. Every winter, Marion hung a rope line from the cabin door to the ridge, a path through the snow that could be followed by feel on the worst nights, and every spring, Mara took the rope down and coiled it beside the door. One meaningful detail survived all the others. Mara kept Jory's brass candle shield on the cave shelf beside the ledger, polishing it once a year with a cloth and lamp oil, and when Tamsin asked why, Mara said, "Because he gave it to your father, and your father gave it to us, and we do not let useful things go dark." On the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature on the north rim of Camas Prairie dropped to 50 degrees below zero, and the wind blew snow sideways across the basalt ridge until the world was white and featureless and deadly. Ephraim Vale had said, standing beside an empty wood rack on a frozen morning, "A man with no cordwood in January has already chosen his grave." He was not wrong about the danger. He was wrong about the grave. Marion Price did choose a grave-shaped place, a black split in the basalt, 27 inches wide, damp, dark, smelling of minerals and steam. He crawled into it because every other option was gone. He did not crawl in to die. He learned where the warm air moved, where the water ran, where the rock could hold, and where it could fall. He tested the flame. He marked the turns. He listened to the stone, and when the worst night came, he opened the door. Snow blows white across the ridge in winter, the cabin dark below, the sage flat buried, the road to Soldier erased. But from the sealed fissure, thin and steady. A breath of steam rises through pine boughs and timber and stone, not enough to see from town, but enough for anyone who knew where to look. The earth holds its heat. It held it before Marion Price, and it holds it still, patient and warm, waiting for the next person desperate enough or wise enough to press a hand against the rock and feel what the surface never shows. In a winter that punished every open door, Marion Price survived because he found the one place the earth had not let go of its heat.